Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description.
Straw Hat Luffy, The Black Fist by J.R.R. Toast. What if Luffy had never eaten the devil fruit Shanks had brought into the bar that day? What if he started sailing a little earlier than canon? How would his story be different? Would he be the same Luffy we know and love? One thing is for sure, Luffy and his friends are in for a wild adventure. Adios.
Chapter 32. Outmatched, like the old geezer said, "I gotta go take out some trash," Sanji said, turning away from the woman as she rushed to the moss ball's side. Hopefully, she'd be able to do the stitches on her own. He really didn't need the shitty swordsman dying on him. Luffy would be pissed. He shook the thought away and made his way through the entrance of the Bharati, stepping over broken pieces of wood. Jin rolled out from under his captain and groaned, slowly bringing his body into a sitting position before making to stand back up. His hazy eyes found a person walking out of the entrance of the restaurant, and they eventually cleared enough for him to make out a head of blonde hair. "Damn it," Krieg screamed, slamming his fist into the wood. "Who the hell are these damn kids?" He spat blood from his mouth and scowled at the approaching figure as he also stood to his feet, brandishing his golden shield in the chef's direction. "The name's Sanji," the blonde said, stopping a short distance away from the two recovering pirates. He sent the men a teasing smirk before making to bow, "Chef of the..." Sanji paused when he realized he didn't know the name of the pirate group he'd joined, his cheek reddening slightly. It was probably something he should have asked his captain. The boy shrugged to himself and straightened back out, his small smirk still in place. He'd just have to guess for now, the Straw Hat Pirates. He said proudly. It sounded good at least. He'd ask Mosshead if he was right when the idiot woke up. You know what? Maybe he'd just wait until Luffy got back. He didn't need to give the shitty swordsman a reason to make fun of him. Krieg watched the chef rise from his bow and growled at the insulting gesture. "So you're with the brat in the straw hat, just like the injured kid. Don't lump me in with that shitty piece of moss." Sanji scowled. He quickly wiped the expression from his face and replaced it with something more neutral. Mosshead could wait. He had more important things to take care of at the moment. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm gonna nicely ask the two of you to leave," he started, eyes thinning into a glare, "and if you refuse, I'm gonna beat the shit out of you." Krieg's expression turned more violent at the words, if anything, his hand tenderly holding his bruised face. The chef could tell his words angered the pirate captain, but he shrugged uncaringly. Instead of trying to reason with Don Krieg, Sanji sent the man's first mate a pleading look. "Sure you don't just want to leave?" He felt like he probably had more of a chance of getting through to Jin rather than the man's captain. He looked like the more reasonable of the two. That being said, Jin didn't look all that happy either. "I take that as a no?" he awkwardly asked. Silence reigned for a long moment before the blonde sighed, the tip of his right boot beginning to tap on the wood. His hand reached into his coat pocket and he pulled out a cigarette, placing the white stick in his mouth before lighting it. He took in a deep breath and blew the smoke from his lungs, leaving himself with a pleasant buzz. Nothing like a nice cigarette before a fight. "All right." Sanji sighed once again. His boot was beginning to tap faster and his muscles started to tense. "Let's get this over with." He looked up, his blue-gray eyes meeting those of his soon-to-be opponents, and they suddenly shadowed, a scowl rising to his lips. "Last thing." His muscles tensed even harder as he prepared to jump in the direction of the two pirates. "You said you were gonna take this ship? Well, let me tell you something." The chef's foot suddenly stopped in its tapping and he wasted no time in launching himself off the ground, his eyes alit with a fiery anger. "No one touches my damn restaurant." "Faster, Levi!" Luffy shouted while he kept a tight grip on the sea monster's reins. The Mary suddenly lurched forward at the words and the boy turned to look behind the ship, his face visibly paling. The dark clouds painting the sky black had come a couple of hours after they began sailing and were quickly catching up. It felt like no matter how fast they went, the darkness continued to gain on them. The straw-hatted teen groaned, turning back to the water in front of him. If they got caught up in the storm, it was sure to slow them down a good bit. He didn't even know if Levi would be able to continue following Nami's scent through the rain. He glanced over his shoulder at the wall of water somehow still gaining on them and sighed. his eyes moving back to the horizon. "As fast as you can, Levi," the boy commanded, his black orbs hardening. They needed to make as much progress as possible before the dark clouds caught up because, after that, traveling would be much slower. He looked down at the figurehead of the Mary and sent the wooden lamb an apologetic smile. "Sorry, Mary," he said, reaching down to softly place his hand on the wood, "but I know you can handle it. It'll only be for a little bit." Luffy didn't think they were going to be able to escape from the storm's grasp with the way things were looking. Eventually, it was going to catch them, and when it did, they'd have to slow back down. This was as far as he was willing to go when it came to risking his precious ship. Trying to sail this fast through an obviously bad storm was more than he was willing to put Mary through. The vessel seemed to almost vibrate underneath his palm as its speed drastically increased, and he smiled tenderly. "Yeah, she's important to me too." The boy went to lift his hand, but before he could, he realized something and was taken aback momentarily, his eyes as wide as saucers. Mary?" Luffy asked softly, shock still apparent on his face while he stared at the hand still connected to the ship's white wood. Did you just talk?" "No one touches my damn restaurant," Sanji roared, flying through the air with his toe pointed in the direction of his adversary. Jin's eyes widened and he barely had time to duck, the chef's form sailing over him and ruffling the hair on his head. "Jin," Don Krieg said, his hand coming out of the inside of his coat holding two small black cylinders. He tossed them in his first mate's direction without another word and rushed toward their adversary. He'd been made a fool of enough today. It was time for someone to pay. The pirate caught the items his captain had thrown at him before the man burst in Sanji's direction with a roar. He eyed the small cylinders and immediately knew what they were, pressing the buttons on the bottom side of each. Small mechanical sounds came from the two black pieces of metal before they both began to largen. Before long, two fully extended metal batons rested in his hands. He would usually screw on the ends to make them into his tonfa, but the large metal balls had been left on the ship, so he'd have to make do with what he had. Hopefully, it would be enough, but for some reason, he wasn't so sure it would be. Sanji's leg knocked an arm careening toward his face off course and he slid into the guard of his opponent, his foot rising from the ground in a flash. The black boot slid past the shield Krieg was using to protect himself and connected with the center of his chest. A groan of pain coming from the pirate captain's mouth as he slid backward a couple of feet. The boy smirked at the growl he could hear coming from the man's lips and turned in the direction of a pair of rapid footsteps, finding Jin rushing at his back with his two weapons held above his head. Sanji watched the pair of batons closely, and in the same moment that the pirate brought the weapons downward, his leg shot up in front of his body. The black metal connected with the blonde's guard and he pushed against the weapons, sending the man holding them careening backward. Before he could follow the stumbling pirate, he felt a tickle on the back of his neck and immediately bent forward. A fist flew over his head and he continued to lean, his right leg as a viper. The bottom of his black soul buried itself into the right side of Krieg's hip and the man was thrown from his feet before he could even so much as blink. The pirate captain's eyes widened when he felt his body rise into the air, his side aching even through the thick armor he wore underneath his shirt. He roughly landed on his back and was almost immediately on his feet, a guttural growl leaving his lips as he brandished his shield once again. He was already wishing he hadn't left all his useful weapons on the ship. His eyes glanced down to the golden medal resting in his hand. At least he still had that. He shook his head and sprinted his way back into the fray. He'd look for a good opportunity to use it, but, right now, all he really wanted to do was punch this kid. Sanji sprang from the ground, two batons passing underneath his feet, and bent his body backward in the air to dodge a golden shield passing over his head. He landed on the wood below and his eyes were immediately met with black metal. His body folded and he brought his right leg up with as much strength as he could muster, the tip of his black shoe finding the underside of Jin's chin. The man's eyes widened before he was suddenly launched into the air, his teeth slamming against each other as his mouth was kicked shut. Blood was spat from his mouth when his body roughly landed on the wood and he groaned, tucking into a roll. He stood to his feet and spat out another glob of crimson liquid while watching his captain attempt to land a hit on the blonde chef. Sanji's right leg cracked through the air in Krieg's direction, the man managing to parry the blow with his shield and find his way inside the blonde's guard. His eyes widened when he felt a fist bury itself in his stomach and he gasped, his feet skidding against the wood while he slid backward. His eyes came back up from the ground and he grinned at the two men sprinting in his direction. "Is this all you got?" the chef insulted. Krieg growled at the words and pushed himself to move even faster. He was going to make this stupid brat eat those words. Darkness suddenly gave birth to light as Zoro's eyes peeled open and he groaned in pain. His chest felt like it was on fire. The swordsman's hand came up to gently probe the area and he hissed when his palm made contact with the slightly wet cloth covering his upper body. He rode out the pulsing ache he'd left himself with and laid his hand back by his side, continuing to squint for a moment while his eyes adjusted to the light. Along with his slowly focusing vision, the haze in his mind was beginning to recede as well and he glanced around, looking for the woman who'd fixed him up. "How the hell are you awake right now?" a voice questioned from above. The swordsman turned his head in the direction of the words and found the person he was searching for. Her green dress was soaked in, what he assumed was, his blood, and she was staring at him with a pair of wide brown eyes. He smirked at her, ignoring the question and groaning as he lifted his body off the ground to sit up. "Thanks for taking care of me, Doc." The woman continued to gape for a moment before moving to help the boy. She had absolutely no clue how he was conscious right now. "Where's the cook?" Zoro asked, looking around the dining area for the stupid perv. The fact that he wasn't dead meant the idiot wasn't completely useless. "He's outside," she said, pointing at the broken front door while still staring incredulously at the Verde. "He said he had to go take out some trash." The swordsman looked in the direction she was pointing and now that he was paying more attention, realized he could hear commotion coming from outside. "Are they still fighting?" he asked curiously. If they were, it might be a good chance to see if the cook could actually be useful when they made it to the Grand Line. The woman cautiously nodded her head, not exactly sure why her patient would want the answer to that question. Zoro kept his eyes glued to the broken entrance, listening to the quiet sounds of the fight going on outside. "Mind helping me stand?" he asked. "What?" the woman questioned. What was he even talking about? He shouldn't even be conscious right now, let alone standing. The swordsman peeled his eyes away from the door and a few pained chuckles came from his lips when he saw the expression on the woman's face. "I said, do you mind helping me stand up?" he repeated. He pointed in the direction of the door. "I want to go watch that idiot fight." The woman looked between the door and the swordsman before going back and forth a couple of times, her face still showing a slight bit of shock. "If you don't help me, I'm just gonna do it myself," he reasoned. He looked down at his chest and then back to the woman. "And I would hate for you to have to redo my stitches because I tore them." The words seemed to be the right ones because she sighed and bent down to hang Zoro's arm over her shoulder. She shot the Verde a glare. As a doctor, she didn't condone people with his kind of injuries moving right after surgery, but she knew he was serious when he said he did himself, and she really didn't want to redo those stitches. Zoro groaned when the two moved to stand, but he was eventually on his feet and the woman led him in the direction of the door. As they neared, the sounds of fighting began to become louder and the swordsman had to resist the urge to scowl at the part of him that was a little excited. He liked watching people fight. The two crossed the threshold of the restaurant and their vision was immediately met with Sanji's form rapidly falling through the air while smoke poured off his right leg. "Smoked Apol," the chef roared, bringing his smoking right leg down on Don Krieg's shoulder. The man attempted to raise his shield above him but was nowhere near quick enough, his enemy's smoking black shoe slamming into him unimpeded. He hissed when he felt the armor covering his right shoulder crack, his body crashing into the ground. Jin wasted no time worrying for his captain, rushing in behind the blonde with his arms lagging behind his body. "Skullcrusher!" the pirate yelled, whipping his hands forward with his target's head in between his batons. His eyes widened when the chef's upper body snapped forward and his metal batons connected with each other sending painful vibrations through his arms. Sanji's smoking leg snapped out behind him and found Jin's right knee, the man crumbling to the ground to avoid having his leg broken in half. He continued to lean forward and his hand found the wood below as he pushed himself into a handstand. "Smoked Cotlet," he shouted, rotating on his hand. His right leg flashed out into the ribs of the man making to attack him again and an audible crack rang out into the air before he flew in the opposite direction. The blonde flipped back to his feet and watched the pirate captain scramble to stop himself from rolling into the water, turning to face the man's first mate rushing in his direction once again. He stood still while he watched his adversaries approach, his mind thinking on the fight so far. It hadn't been an even match from the beginning. That wasn't to say they weren't good fighters. They were obviously both experienced when it came to battle. Jin was fast and, against most people, those batons of his were sure to be lethal. Don Krieg was strong and the armor he wore would have more than likely made him more or less invulnerable in most cases. It wasn't until Sanji's legs had heated up a little bit that he could even crack it. The biggest gap between them was the fact that the blonde felt like he could read them both like a book. He didn't even really know why, and he couldn't tell exactly what was coming when one of them attacked, but he always knew something was coming. With that being the case, it all boiled down to speed, and that was something neither of them could match him in. He shook his head as he dropped to his knees and slid underneath a pair of batons smash he'd previously occupied. He sprang back to his feet and he used one of his legs to push himself into the air and rotate his body, the outside of his still smoking leg finding the right side of Jin's neck. The man's eyes widened when he saw wisps of smoke floating by the side of his face and wasted no time in diving forward, the tip of a smoking black shoe glancing off of him and sending him tumbling to the ground. He held his neck in pain as he rolled back to his feet, eyes wide. If that had fully connected. Jin gulped, his hand massaging his bruised skin. He didn't even really know what was happening. It shouldn't have been a fair fight, and it wasn't, but the thing was, it wasn't a fair fight for them. They'd managed to land a couple of solid blows, but most of the attacks he and his captain had thrown at the chef had either been dodged or parried. Something they couldn't say for themselves. He looked down at his battered form before his head came back up to watch his captain and the blonde chef clash once again. For what felt like the millionth time that day, he began to wonder. Just who exactly were these kids that he'd met? Don Krieg screamed in frustration when his fist was met with air once again. Why couldn't he hit this damn kid? Jin, he growled, choking on his words when he felt a leg slam into his left side. The armor protecting him cracked in the same way the opposite side had earlier and his body found the ground, the wood shattering underneath his heavy form. The man groaned but wasted no time in rolling to the side to dodge a smoking foot smashing into the ground where he'd previously been. He quickly stood to his feet and made to attack once again but stopped when he heard something rattling against the wood at his feet. He looked down and his eyes widened at seeing pieces of his golden armor beginning to fall out from under his shirt. He looked closer and realized that the heavy pieces of metal were accompanied by dripping blood. The sound of rapid footsteps made Krieg look up and his vision was suddenly consumed by wisps of white smoke. Time seemed to slow down for the pirate captain as he watched the smoking black boot inch ever closer. It felt like his life was flashing before his eyes. Suddenly, his shirt was grabbed from behind and he was pulled out of the way, Jin stepping in front of him and catching the blonde chef's attack on his batons. Sanji hung in the air for a moment while the two fought their battle of strength, but Jin's arms gave out soon after and the boy's legs smashed into the side of his face sending him to the edge of the dock. The blonde landed on his feet and looked at the two men sprawled out on the fin of his restaurant in an almost apologetic manner. In another life, one where he hadn't traveled with Luffy, one where he hadn't already fought a pirate much stronger than either of them, maybe they would have stood a chance, maybe they could have even won. However, fighting Psycho P all those months ago, and even the training he'd done in the months after, had forced him to grow far beyond anything his current opponents could handle. Sanji watched the two pirates slowly rise to their feet, Jin wiping blood from his lips and his captain shedding his shredded top to reveal the cracked and crumbling armor underneath. Krieg eyed the brat standing opposite of him and could feel liquid rage running through his veins. Nothing had gone right ever since they went to the Grand Line. First, he'd lost his entire armada to one man, and then, just when he thought he'd found a silver lining in coming across Red-Leg Zeph, he'd been treated like a rag doll by a kid half his size. To top it off, when he tried to kill the kid's friend and ease the rage he felt in his chest, one of his other friends began treating him and his first mate like they were a pair of punching bags. The pirate captain removed his hand, now stained red, from underneath his armor and let it drop down to his side as he stared down his opponent. The sound of footsteps came from over his shoulder but he made no move to turn, already knowing it was his first mate coming to stand with him. He saw Jin stop out of the corner of his eye and focused back in on their opponent. This wasn't over, it wasn't over until he killed everyone that had made him look like a fool. Leave, Sanji demanded, standing with his back straight and returning the stares of his opponents. There was no point in continuing. I don't like the idea of killing someone I just fed, so leave. He added, gauging the two for their reactions. Not before I kill you and take this ship. Krieg answered in defiance, oblivious to the looks his first mate was sending him. The chef sighed at the words, let's finish this then. Silence reigned over the area for a moment, the three staring at one another as Zoro and the doctor watched on from the deck above. Krieg glanced down at the inside of his shield and made sure everything was set correctly. His opposite hand reached into his coat and pulled out his mask. He'd been looking to do this since the fight started, but there hadn't been a good time. Now though, it was time for people to start dying. And he wouldn't be taken by surprise this time. He glanced at his first mate before shrugging. He had the antidote, so he probably wouldn't die. His eyes found the object of his ire and he didn't even have it in him to grin at the idea of the brat's death. He was so angry. The man took one more glance at the inside of his shield before suddenly raising the golden metal in the direction of his adversary, his eyes glowing with a maniacal sort of anger. Just as he went to pull the trigger on the inside of his shield, he realized that he'd lost target. Where the hell had he gone? He'd been right there not a second earlier. His eyes wildly looked around as he searched for the chef, his heart almost jumping out of his chest when he heard words coming from above his head. Sanji's form fell through the air on a direct course for Don Krieg and he began to flip, adding as much momentum as possible to his smoking leg. In the blink of an eye, his rotating form stopped and accelerated in the direction of his opponent's head, smoke billowing off of him like he was a raging fire. Collier! He yelled, the wind howling around his body and whipping his blonde hair around his face. The pirate captain rose his shield above his head as quickly as he could, his eyes as wide as saucers. He managed to get it up in time and grinned a bloodthirsty grin, his finger beginning to pull the trigger to his secret weapon, MH. Smoke shot. Sanji screamed, his smoking foot connecting with the golden shield being held above Krieg's head. The force of the chef's weight combined with his accelerated momentum caused the metal to cave in on itself, a massive crack coming from the arm holding it sounding into the air. Don Krieg screamed in agony when he felt all the bones in his right arm violently shatter, the appendage seeming to somehow shrink in on itself while Sanji's leg continued to force it downward. Before the man could so much as blink, the shield smashed into his own face and his screams immediately ceased, his consciousness fading from the waking world. Sanji's momentum kept pushing him forward until his opponent was smashed into the wood below and he roughly landed, his foot still embedded in the golden metal he now stood on. Without even looking down at the person he'd smashed into the ground, the chef looked up and gave his one still conscious opponent a hard stare, white wisps of smoke still curling off his foot. Jin looked from his captain's unconscious form to the blonde standing on top of him and couldn't help but freeze under the look being shot in his direction. This wasn't a fight he could win, he knew it. Especially not by himself. It hadn't even been close when the Don had been conscious. His arms dropped to his side and it felt like the strength was sapped from them. Even if he could have won, he didn't know if he'd have had the will to continue. HD to fight the chef in the first place. The two opponents stared each other down for a moment, tension hanging in the air along with the silence as they stood unmoving. Blue-gray eyes narrowed. Leave, Jin. The chef eventually said, stepping off of the shield and the man he was standing on. Take your captain and never come back here again. He stared the pirate down for a second before breaking eye contact. He didn't wait for an answer and turned around, beginning to walk back in the direction of the Bharati. I need a boat, Jin said, sighing and bending down to peel the shield off of his captain's face. He paled when he saw the bloody mess underneath. His eyes found what he assumed was his right arm and his stomach roiled at the sight. It was just an unrecognizable lump of bloody meat. He didn't even know if his captain would be able to use it again. He tore his gaze away, not being able to stomach the sight anymore, and looked at the man's still face, nervously. Just in case, he brought his ear to his mouth and relief filled him when he could hear small breaths. Sanji pointed to the edge of the Bharati's fin where several small crafts sat. Take a cargo raft. He turned and flashed a glare in the pirate's direction, and I mean it, Jin, don't ever come back here. Don't worry, Sanji. Jin replied, slowly picking up his unconscious captain and unceremoniously throwing him over his shoulder. I'll make sure of it. At the nod of the blonde's head, he made his way in the direction of the rafts, softly dropping Krieg into one of them. He stared at the unconscious man for a moment, still slightly in shock at the turn the day had taken, before shaking his head and beginning to untie the small vessel from the restaurant. Sanji went to make his way up the steps, but, before he could, Jin's voice stopped him and he turned in his direction. "I really am sorry, Sanji," the man said, preparing to jump into his small raft. "I never meant for any of this to happen." He sighed, looking down at his captain once again before turning to send the chef one last smile. "I just want to say thank you one last time." The pirate bowed in the direction of the boy who'd saved him from starvation, and he put as much sincerity as he could into his next words. "Thank you for the meal, Sanji." He looked up and smiled at him one more time before turning away to face the sea. "It was the best I've ever had." Sanji didn't reply as he watched the ship sail away, smiling lightly before he turned to the steps behind him. Jin was a good guy. It was a shame his captain was so shitty. "Surprised you survived, cook," Zoro said, watching the cook ascend the stairs. He'd honestly been pretty impressed, but, as usual, he'd never be caught saying that out loud. "I could say the same to you, Mosshead." The blonde scowled, cresting the steps. "I think it's about time I head out too," the woman standing next to Zoro said. She'd had way more than enough excitement for one day. Honestly, she wasn't sure she'd have a crazier one for the rest of her life. Sanji's eyes turned to hearts and he twirled to the woman's side. "So soon? But Ms. Doctor," the boy moaned. A lecherous smile suddenly spread across his lips. "I hate seeing you leave, but I understand." He shuffled closer and went to whisper in her ear. "However, I think I may have gotten some injuries in that fight. You wouldn't mind giving me a checkup, would you?" The woman laughed at the obvious attempt at flirting, stepping away from the chef and sending him a teasing eye before making her way to the steps. "I think you're gonna be just fine, Mr. Chef. It didn't look like you were having much trouble out there." She stepped down the first step and sent him a smirk over her shoulder. Besides, she flashed her hand in his direction, the diamond resting on her ring finger glinting in the sunlight. "I'm spoken for." She had to resist the urge to laugh at the sad puppy look that overtook the blonde's face. "If you really need a checkup," she pointed at Zoro, grinning in humor, "you could always have your friend do it for you." The reaction to her words was immediate. "We are not friends," the two shouted simultaneously. The woman turned away with a laugh on her lips and waved goodbye over her shoulder, making her way in the direction of her small boat. "Green boy," she said, turning to address Zoro, "change those bandages out every day or your wound will probably get infected. Got it?" "You got it, Doc," Zoro answered in reply. He sent her a small smile. "Thanks again for patching me up." The doctor waved the words away and stepped into her small vessel. "It's my job. Don't sweat it. I'm just glad I was here." She turned and addressed both the boys one last time. "If you're ever around Katina Island and need some doctoring, look me up," she said, turning to face the sea. "The name's Serene." Without another word, she pushed off and began the short journey back home with a crazy story to tell her husband when she got back. "Will do," Sanji screamed in reply as he and Zoro watched her boat sail away from the restaurant. They sat in silence until it left their sight, eventually turning and walking back through the broken entrance of the Barati. "Hey, Mosshead," Sanji said as they stepped over the broken pieces of the front door. "What?" the swordsman replied with a scowl. Now that the excitement was over and done with, it was finally hitting him that he'd be stuck with the stupid chef for the next couple of days. Hopefully, it wouldn't be any longer than that. "Where the hell did Luffy go?" the chef asked. With everything dealt with, he wanted to know why he'd been left there with the stupid swordsman. "Went to go get Nami," Zoro answered, shortly, smirking at the look of indignation coming from the other boy's face. Sanji's jaw hung open and his feet rooted in place when he heard the words. His captain had gone to find his goddess and he was forced to stay here, with Mosshead? His blue-gray eyes looked up and they found a head of green hair walking through the door to the kitchen. Likely to go steal booze. His gaze rose to the ceiling and he groaned before stepping in the direction of the swinging door. "Damn you, Luffy, I hope you're having a miserable time." Nami eyed the horizon in anticipation. She'd been traveling for close to 2 days and Konami Island was sure to be appearing soon. She was making incredible time. It almost felt like the winds could sense her urgency and were aiding her in her travels. The trip had honestly reminded her how much she loved sailing and navigation. Navigation. Why was it that every time she thought about it a straw hat appeared in her head? It was so frustrating. And yet, Every time she saw that hat in her mind's eye, she could feel hope suffuse through her body. It was such a strange feeling. She didn't know what it made her hopeful for, but she liked it nonetheless. As the orange eyed the horizon for any sign of her island, for the first time in what felt like forever, she thought about what she might do after her village was free. For so long, she'd never really known what she was going to do after being done with Arlong. She'd never even really let herself think about it, but after meeting Luffy, she hated the fact that deep in her heart she knew what she really wanted to do. She wanted to sail with him. She wanted to become a pirate. Even thinking the words, the girl was shocked at the absence of any ill feelings. It was genuinely insane. A boy she'd met by sheer coincidence had forever changed her view on pirates. It was something she'd never thought possible. Before their chance encounter, she was sure she knew what it meant to be a pirate. It meant being the kind of person that tore families apart. But Luffy was anything but that. Suddenly, a speck appeared on the horizon and Nami's heartbeat began to quicken. Almost as if it could sense the change in her, the wind increased in its movement and propelled her than it had gone for the whole trip. The change in the air went unnoticed, however, determination rising to the girl's eyes. This was it. Thunder rumbled in the direction she'd come from and made the girl turn to the opposite side of her small vessel. It had been lucky she'd left when she did. The storm would have definitely slowed her down had she been caught in it. It had been chasing her almost since she'd left, and it didn't look like it was going to dissipate anytime soon either. More than likely, it would be hitting Konami sometime after she arrived. She eyed the numerous black clouds and the visible wall of rain. She did not envy anyone stuck in that. Nami shook her head and turned back to the growing speck on the horizon, flutters rising to her stomach. This time it would be different, she'd make sure of it. This time she'd free her village no matter what. Chapter 33, Homecoming. The closer Nami got to Konami, the faster her heart began to beat. She looked over her shoulder at the dark clouds growing closer and couldn't help but sigh slightly in relief. She hadn't really been sure if she was going to beat it or not, however. The winds blowing the storm in her direction had also increased her speed and she'd managed to stay ahead, but not by much. It was definitely going to hit the island shortly after she arrived. The orange turned back to the landmass growing larger on the horizon and took a deep breath, slowly letting the air out after holding it for a second. Her plan was simple. Dock at the opposite end of the island, sneak her way to her house, grab the money she needed from underneath her tangerine trees, find a wheelbarrow to put everything in, and then, she'd try to make her way to Arlong Park unnoticed where she would, hopefully, finally free her village. Her heartbeat began to grow even faster. It was finally time to end her servitude to that blue-skinned monster. She hoped that this time, it was actually true. Nami could only pray that everything went according to plan. She shook her head and began directing the boat toward the backside of the island. Hopefully, Nijiko wasn't home. That would surely complicate things. Keep going. Levi. Luffy screamed over the pouring rain. Don't lose her. No matter what. His legs were wrapped tightly around the figurehead of the Mary and his muscles strained while he tried to keep himself anchored to the ship. The vessel rocked violently in the sea as it traveled through turbulent waters, huge waves crashing against its sides and sending even more water over the railing, drenching the already soaked ship even further. The two traveling companions had slowed in their pursuit of their orange-haired navigator, the storm being the cause. It had been just as the boy predicted. It caught them in the middle of the night and their travel speed had been cut back considerably in consideration for the Mary. Levi said he could still follow the direction of Nami's scent, but it was obviously getting harder. The rain was making things difficult. Luffy's eyes glanced around at the crashing waves before he looked down at the figurehead of his ship, placing his palm on the wood while he tightly held Levi's reins in his opposite hand. "You doing all right, Mary?" he asked softly, the words barely making it to his own ears over the pounding rain. He waited a long moment for a reply but eventually lifted his hand with a sigh when one didn't come. The ship had been quiet ever since it had first spoken to him, but the pirate captain was sure his mind wasn't playing tricks on him at the time. He'd heard Mary's voice, he was certain of it. Why it refused to answer him now, he wasn't sure. However, that wasn't going to keep him from trying. He wanted to hear it again. It had been like that of a child, but, at the same time, so soft and soothing that it left him with a smile just thinking about it. "Are we getting closer, Levi?" Luffy yelled down to the violently rocking waters, grabbing the reins with both hands once again. The straw-hatted teen barely heard the loud rumble coming from under the crashing waves, but the words reached him and he grinned determinedly, his eyes peering through the rain to the horizon. He didn't know how much longer it would be until they caught up to her, but they were getting closer, and once they found her, his navigator would be coming with him whether she liked it or not. Nami stepped off her boat and looked up to the sky when she felt light raindrops hitting her skin. She eyed the darkening sky for a moment before shaking her head and grabbing the 2 treasure-filled bags from the boat. With the large cloth sacks in hand, she turned back in the direction of where her home was and immediately started on her way. A part of her wanted to rush and get everything done as quickly as possible, but she managed to keep herself to measured steps, her eyes cautiously probing the area for anything that could get in the way of her freeing her village. The last thing she wanted was a repeat of what happened all those months ago. She hoped she never saw that rat-faced bastard ever again. Anger settled in the orange's stomach just from thinking of the man, so she swept the thoughts from her mind and continued on her way, praying to whoever might be up there looking over her that, for once in her life, things would go smoothly. Deep in the woods just outside the small village of Kokoyashi, a cottage sat. The house was small and would likely only fit a family of no larger than 3 or 4. It was a quaint residence, but it fit nicely in the area it rested in. The most eye-catching part of the small house was the beautiful tangerine grove resting just off its side, with lines of picturesque tangerine trees resting planted in the lush green grass. Inside the cottage, at a small wooden table in the kitchen, 2 figures sat across from each other. The first was a tan man with a dark mustache and a multitude of scars marring his face. He wore a short-sleeved brown uniform that had a policeman-esque look to it. The most curious thing about the man's outfit was his hat and the pinwheel sprouting from the top of it. The person sitting across from him was a woman. She had short light-colored hair with a bluish-purple tint to it. Most of the straight locks were held back by a red ribbon, but the left side hung out and framed her beautiful face. She wore a simple yellow tank top that showed off her curvy figure and a pair of short jean shorts. Her skin was pale and the only thing marring it was the dark tattoo that started at the front of her left shoulder, ran across the top of her chest, down her right arm, and stopped just at the crook of her elbow. The blue-haired girl sighed as she gazed at the knotted wood of the table the 2 sat at. "I'm tired of this, Genzo," she said. She looked up at the man sitting across from her and could see his agreement with her words. "I want it to be over, it's been years." Her gaze shot back down when she felt tears prickling at the corner of her eyes. "I just want Nami to be free, I just want her to be happy," she whispered. Genzo sighed much the same as the girl across from him, sagging in his chair. He felt the same way. It wasn't fair that she had to shoulder the fate of this village all on her own, but what could they do? If they chose to revolt and try their hand at freeing themselves, it would make the years Nami spent as an Arlong pirate pointless. If they even succeeded, which would be a very unlikely outcome, it would be even worse if they died in the process. He just knew the girl would put the weight of their deaths on her shoulders, and that wasn't something he was willing to risk. At least, not at this very moment. The man sighed again, seeming to shrink even further into his seat. "I know, Nijiko," he eventually replied. He looked up at the girl still trying to keep her tears at bay and tried to send her a smile, the gesture falling somewhat short. "But, have some faith in your sister." He leaned his head on the back of the wooden chair and looked up to the ceiling. "She's a strong girl, you know that as well as I do." Nijiko huffed angrily and looked back to the man across from her. "You think you have to remind me of that?" she seethed. "I've had to watch from afar while my sister suffers through literal slavery, Genzo. I know how strong she is." Her burst of anger settled and a sigh left her mouth. "I'm sorry," she apologized, taking a moment before speaking again. "I just miss my sister." The last time she'd even talked to her had been close to a year ago, and it hadn't really been much of a conversation. "The worst part is she doesn't even know we know why she did it," the girl added. "She thinks we all hate her for joining Arlong's crew." Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes once again. "She's all alone, Genzo," she whispered shakily. "She's not." Jenstein back up in his chair. His hands balled into fists. "She's not alone, Nijiko." He looked to the girl across from him, trying to brush away the tears falling from her eyes, and his hands uncurled as he reached across the table to place his over hers. "She may not know it, but she still has us." He sent the girl a small smile. "She'll always have you." A knock at the front door came and interrupted the man before he could finish. both of the table's occupants turning in the direction of the noise. Genzo turned back to Nijiko and nodded his head toward the door, expecting someone? The blue-haired girl looked toward the entrance in confusion. No, Genzo was the only one that really came to see her. Who could it be? A head of orange hair floated through her mind and she was suddenly on her feet. Was it her? A second, more insistent, knock came and Nijiko was pulled out of her thoughts. She shook her head, taking a deep breath before stepping in the direction of the door. More than likely, it was just someone from the village. I'm coming, she shouted in the direction of the entrance. Genzo stood from his place at the table and made to follow the girl. For some reason he was nervous and he wasn't exactly sure why. Nijiko's hand grasped the handle to the front door and she unceremoniously pulled it open, curiously glancing through to see who had come to visit her. Her eyes were met with white fabric and it took her a moment of looking around to realize that it wasn't just one person standing outside the house. They were Marines? The man at the front of the group turned to face the girl, but before he could introduce himself, his eyes found a familiar figure standing just behind her. He stared at the person in contempt, ignoring the girl who'd opened the door momentarily. Why, if it isn't Mr. Genzo, he said, an insulting tint to his voice. Genzo's eyes widened. You. He knew this man. He'd been questioned by him several times over the past few months, mostly about Nami. He didn't know why the Marine captain was so curious about her, but their conversations never left him with a good feeling. The Marine captain bowed, water falling from his wet coat. Yes, it is I. His back straightened out and he looked up, his gaze finding that of the girl he was there to meet. A slimy smile rose to his lips as he stuck his hand out to introduce himself. I don't believe we've had the pleasure of meeting, he said, smiling even wider when he felt a cautious hand slide into his. My name is Nezumi. I'm the captain of the Marine branch that oversees the area your island rests in, branch number 16. The man stated, his smile widening to the point that it looked like it would come off the sides of his face, and, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your sister. Nami continued to steadily trek through the forest, her cautious eyes not leaving a single area untouched. Her clothes were completely soaked through due to the now pouring rain, and she couldn't help but be thankful that she'd chosen to wear a shirt that wasn't white. Her eyes glanced back toward the wet bags over his shoulders and she could only pray that the few bills in them hadn't been ruined. She needed every penny. The sound of thunder cracked through the air, making the orangeette look up, and she sighed, her even footsteps never ceasing in their calculated movement. The storm was getting worse and she wasn't too happy about it. Now, she'd have to find something to cover all the money with so it didn't get ruined. Her stash wasn't made up of all bills, but it was a big enough chunk to make her worry about it. The girl sighed once again. Things were already complicated enough before the storm. She shook her head, her eyes narrowing on a familiar opening in the tree line. She'd do whatever she had to, but she could think about that later. She needed to take things one step at a time. The first thing to do was get the treasure out from underneath the tangerine trees. And it looked like she would be taking that step soon. Her feet continued to carry her closer to her destination, when she suddenly froze in place. A loud voice rising into the air from the area her house rested in. All right, men, good work. Our job here is done. Gather everything up and head back to the ship. Nami quietly made her way to the tree line and hid behind one of the large trunks, cautiously peering around the side of it to see what was going on. When her eyes found the large group of people standing in front of her house, she froze, a look of shock and horror taking over her face. No, this couldn't be happening. Her eyes shifted slowly across the area before they stopped, wide brown eyes staring, unblinking. The orangeette's heart began to beat so hard and loud it almost drowned out the sound of the pouring rain pounding the ground around her. Her face was hot and it felt like her blood literally began to boil underneath her skin. She continued to stand there and stare because it was all she could physically do. Her rage-filled eyes glued to her mother's uprooted tangerine grove. For what felt like an eternity, the girl kept her gaze trained on the destroyed tangerine trees, the anger in her stomach continuing to grow hotter and hotter as it twisted her insides into tight little knots. It wasn't until the voice that first made her stop spoke up again, that she was able to tear her gaze away from her precious trees, eyes dripping with tears of white-hot anger. As for you two, Nezumi said, scowling at the two people on the muddy ground below him while his men held them both at gunpoint, you're lucky I don't arrest you both right now. The man smiled his slimy smile before making to turn away. "Obstruction of justice is a serious crime, I'll have you know," he said over his shoulder. Rage. It was all Nami could feel. The knots in the girl's stomach continued to tighten almost to the point of pain. It was all-consuming. The oranget didn't even feel her hands loosen, the sound of the cloth sacks splashing to the ground being covered by a violent crack of thunder. Nezumi jumped at the loud noise, looking at the sky in annoyance. The wind was beginning to pick up and he couldn't help the widening of his eyes at the quickly darkening sky. It looked unnatural. A gust of air blew through the area and he was almost knocked over by its strength, scrambling to regain his footing. "All right, men, quickly now. I don't want to be in this storm any longer than I have to. Let's get a move on," he commanded, still slightly off balance. The Marine captain finally stilled as a multitude of Marines, each carrying large cloth sacks filled to the brim with valuables, stepped past him and in the direction of Arlong Park. He smiled in glee at the amount of money he'd made as he watched his men pass him by and eventually went to follow them. However, before he could take his first step in their direction, two gasps coming from the opposite direction made him stop and turn. What could those two possibly be getting so worked up about? Nezumi's body fully rotated and before he could even lay his eyes on the two, he was distracted by a scream of anger bursting into the air. He immediately went to turn in the direction of the noise, but the person the scream had come from was faster. Before he even had time to realize what was going on, a fist buried itself into the side of his face, a sickening crunch coming from the knuckle bones of the hand sinking into his skin and the cheek underneath. A cry of agony left his mouth before he was lifted off his feet and sent tumbling in the opposite direction. The sounds of Nami's pained and rageful screams were drowned out by a loud crack of thunder ripping through the sky, Nezumi's body landing roughly in the mud and turning the majority of his white uniform brown. She ignored the searing pain of her broken knuckles and took off toward the object of her ire, her stomach still twisted into tight knots of anger. One punch wasn't even close to a narning underneath her skin. Genzo and Nijiko watched the scene unfold with wide eyes, both too bewildered to fully process what was happening. The two sat there, frozen in shock and unable to do anything but watch while Nami sprinted toward Nezumi's downed form. Thunder cracked in the sky and Nami dove through the air, her already broken fist cocked back. She didn't care about the pain. She only wanted one thing at that moment. She wanted this man dead. Her body roughly landed on top of Nezumi's just as the man turned in her direction and she shot her fist through the air, the roar leaving her mouth sounding like that of a lioness. Nezumi screamed once again when he felt broken knuckles collide with his nose, the sensitive bones shattering underneath the force of the punch thrown at him. The oranget wasted no time in readjusting herself, so she was straddling the Marine captain, her fist already in the air once again. The bloody knuckles shot downward and connected with their target once again, flying blood mixing with the water falling from the sky. Another roar left her lips and she raised her opposite hand, the appendage already curled and ready to strike. Just when the girl's arm shot in the direction of the bloody face below, she gasped, the air leaving her lungs as a shoulder buried itself into her stomach. Her body was lifted off of Nezumi and she was sent careening backward along with the Marine who'd tackled her. The two roughly landed, mud splashing on impact and covering both of their forms before they rolled to a stop. Nami growled while she struggled to remove the arms wrapped around her stomach, but the man was much too strong. Before long, he had her in a sitting position with her arms held behind her back and her head facing the ground. Almost like she was crazed, the oranget continued to fight against the man holding her down. It wasn't enough yet, the fire, it was still so hot, her stomach felt like it had the sun inside of it. The knots continued to tighten while she watched Nezumi's men help the man slowly stand to his feet, blood dripping from his brutalized face. Even through her anger, she couldn't help the slight feeling of satisfaction suffusing through her at the sound of the bastard's cries of pain. Nezumi stood fully to his feet and his eyes immediately found the girl who had caused all the pain he was currently feeling. He growled, yelping when the action irritated his broken bones, and pushed his men's arms away in anger. His feet carried him to a spot just out of the struggling girl's reach. Nami stared up at the man defiantly. The more she looked at him, the more fuel was added to the fire, her stomach continuing to grow ever tighter. She fought even harder against the man holding her in place. At this point, it didn't matter if she could get out or not, She just had to do something. If she stayed still for even a moment, she was sure her rage would consume her. The Marine captain looked down on the girl, practically frothing at the mouth in an attempt to reach him, and scowled at her. He was angry. He'd never been in so much pain before, and he hated it. His eyes shadowed as he brought his curled hand above his head. She was going to pay. Without hesitation, his fist shot out toward the girl's cheek, a snarl of anger leaving his lips. "You bitch." A grunt of pain left the Orange's mouth when she felt Nezumi's fist crash into her face, her head snapping to the side. The only thing that kept her upright was the man still holding her arms behind her back. Genzo and Nijiko were suddenly snapped out of their stupor at seeing Nami being struck, growls of anger coming from both of them as they prepared to sprint to her aid. "You two, stay where you are," Nezumi shouted over the rain. He nodded his head in the direction of a couple of his men, and their rifles immediately rose. "And you?" the Marine captain said, facing the orange-haired girl once again. He bent down so he was at eye level with her, the scowl still firmly rooted on his face. "Unfortunately, I'm reluctant to damage you any further." Red suddenly splattered over the man's eyes and he fell backward, furiously trying to wipe bloody saliva from his injured face. His hand brushed against the tender bones of his nose a little too hard, and he screamed in agony when he felt the shattered bones underneath the skin shift slightly. Nami smirked a bloody smirk at the screams sounding into the air. They were so loud, she could hear them almost perfectly, even with the crashing thunder and pouring rain. A part of her relished in it. The other part, however, was still absolutely enraged. The throb in Nezumi's face eventually settled down enough for him to sit back up, and he growled in anger, his gaze landing on the person who'd caused him more pain than he'd felt in his entire life. He wanted her to suffer. Suddenly his hand shot forward and he grabbed the Orange by the mouth, squeezing tightly so her head stayed still and she'd be unable to talk. He smiled at the fiery stare of hatred being sent in his direction because he knew it would only make the girl angrier. "Like I was saying, before I was so rudely interrupted." The sky flashed white, illuminating the maniacal glint in his eye as the Marine captain continued, "I'm reluctant to damage you any further." He shot the girl a knowing look and smiled wider to draw even more of her ire. "I think we both know why." He felt the Orange attempt to bite the inside of his hand at the words. "Tisk tisk tisk, Nami." He chided, squeezing his hand even tighter. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that." He grabbed her face and roughly pulled her forward, pointing to the men still holding onto the bags filled with treasure. "You see those bags, Nami?" The Orange's eyes widened when she saw what he meant. Several of his men were standing there with large cloth sacks hung over their shoulders. She didn't even have to guess what was in them. She already knew. The thought brought white-hot tears to her eyes. It was happening again. Nezumi only continued to smile while the look of distress on the girl's face grew. "That's your life's work right there." A sob vibrated on the inside of the Marine captain's palm, and he had to resist the urge to revel in the anguish he was causing the one who'd made him feel so much pain. "That's right, Nami," he said, forcing the girl to look him in the eyes once again. "Your life's work is mine, now." The man's look of glee only grew. "That means," he began, bringing her face mere inches away from his. "Once I'm gone." His smile widened even further. "Your life will be worthless, literally," he said. His smile turned to a frown of disgust at the tears he could feel soaking his hand. "You'll have no more worth than a slave." Nezumi's ignored the hot liquid dripping onto his hand, and the usual slimy smile he wore rose to his face once more, his ratty eyes peering deep into the tear-stained brown orbs of his captive. "And that is all you will ever be. Arlong's little slave." Nami's body shook violently as she was racked with sob after sob of anguish, the rage tightening her stomach into knots only seeming to grow with every word spoken. "Oh, and Nami," the man added, "if you even attempt to come after me when I drop my hand." He pulled her face in the direction of where Genzo and Nijiko stood with their hands above their heads. "I will personally make sure those two spend the rest of their miserable lives in prison." The Orange's tear-filled eyes met her sister's and, try as she might, she couldn't stop her sobs. Why was it always like this? Her eyes shifted to Genzo's and her tears began to fall even faster. Why did her life have to be one long series of unfortunate events? The hand covering her mouth was suddenly removed and her sobs immediately sounded into the air as she tore her eyes away from the two, turning to watch Nezumi stand to his feet. The cries were like music to the Marine captain's ears. He sighed to himself in satisfaction, smiling one last slimy smile down at the Gavareething from. I meant what I said, Nami. With his piece said and the situation resolved, he turned away from the Orangeade and signaled his men in the direction of Arlong Park, tenderly probing his injured face. Nami watched Nezumi turn his back to her, sitting still while the rain continued to drench her already soaked form. Her tear-stained eyes never left his form as he walked away with the only means she had of freeing herself and her people, the fire in her stomach rising to almost unbearable temperatures. Her teeth ground against each other, tears continuing to fall from her eyes unimpeded. She could hear the blood furiously rushing through her body, her heart pumping faster than it ever had before. It felt like she couldn't breathe. The rain pounded to the ground all around the girl, but she could barely even hear it. She was so distraught. Her blurry eyes moved from Nezumi's back to one of the men carrying a sack of her treasure, and she just couldn't take it anymore. Stop! She whispered into the air in front of her, choking on a sob before she could go on. Please! Nami cried, gritting her teeth in anguish. Please, stop! She could barely even hear herself say the words over the thunder and rain, but she meant them. She would do anything. When the men still made no move to heed her words, a guttural scream left her lips. It felt like she was going to explode if she didn't find some way to release the anger she currently held in her heart. Her arms curled around her middle and she began to rock back and forth while she screamed into her chest, the knots in her stomach somehow continuing to grow even tighter. Stop! The girl screamed again, looking up once more at the group of Marines slowly but surely getting further away. Why was it always her? The thought made her flush with more heat, her stomach curling something fierce. Everything was so hot, too hot, she wanted it to go away. Nijiko made to rush to comfort her sister, but a hand snatched her by the wrist and she was stopped before she could take her first step. What the hell, Genzo? She yelled, scowling at the man. Her sister was in pain and she couldn't just stand there and watch from afar anymore. Why the hell wouldn't he let her go? Genzo made no move to answer the girl, his eyes firmly locked on the arm he held in his hand. The hair on your arms, he said ominously, pointing at her pale skin. The blue-haired girl looked down in confusion, staring for a moment before realizing what he was getting at. The hair on her arms. It was standing straight up. The rain didn't even seem to be affecting it. She eyed herself in shock for a moment before her gaze shifted to the arm of the man holding her wrist. His hair was standing on end too. Nijiko's vision shifted to her sister's still rocking form before it came back to her arm, the small hairs still standing straight up. The wind suddenly picked up and on instinct, she looked toward the sky. It was getting darker, and quickly. What the hell was going on? Her eyes dropped back to Nami and, for the first time, she noticed that her orange locks of hair were beginning to rise seemingly all on their own. Nami lifted her head to the almost black sky, unaware of the effects the air was having on her, and screamed until her throat was bloody. The knots in her stomach tightened drastically and the feeling made her almost want to vomit. It felt like she was inside the sun. Not even the rain bouncing off her skin could cool her down. Her crying eyes found the backs of the Marines carrying away her life's work once again, and she just couldn't bear it anymore. The years of slaving away, every hardship she'd ever faced, everything that had gone wrong in her life, it all hit her at once. It all made her so angry, like a raging inferno. With her heart on the verge of exploding and the feeling in her stomach seeming to reach its peak, the Orangeade screamed one more bloody scream to the sky above before slamming her fists into the mud in front of her with every ounce of strength she had. Nezumi and his men froze when they heard an ominous wail pierce through the air, all of them turning in the direction it was coming from. It was like that of a banshee. Honestly, it frightened them. They watched the girl slam her hands into the mud, and for some strange reason, the action didn't seem like an empty gesture. I said, stop, Nami wailed, the fire in her stomach exploding outward and finding its way into every nook and cranny of her body as thunder violently cracked in the sky above. Suddenly, the air around the group of men began to buzz and Nezumi couldn't help but look up, his curious eyes finding the almost black clouds hanging over them. Had they always been that dark? Before the Marine captain even had the chance to answer the question, the tingling feeling running across his skin began to drastically increase, the hair on every inch of his body rising in response. He desperately glanced around at his men and could see they were experiencing the same thing. Something wasn't right. Panic began to fill him and his eyes found the sky again, hair still standing straight. The black clouds that met his sight seemed to part slightly and he eyed the white sky peeking through. What a strange occurrence, too strange. It wasn't until far too late that the man realized the light wasn't what he first thought. Nezumi barely had time to widen his eyes before his vision was consumed with white, the screams of him and his men being drowned out by the large crack of thunder accompanying the massive strike of lightning that fried every single one of them from the inside out. "We're almost there, Levi. Just a little further," Luffy screamed over the rain. His slick hands tightly gripped the monster's reins as he eyed the landmass in front of him quickly growing larger. "Take me straight to Nami." The storm hadn't let up for even a second after it caught them. If anything, it had gotten worse the closer they got to catching up to their wayward friend. Suddenly, the water directly in front of the Mary was sent in every different direction, the head of a large sea creature bursting through the waves as it roared at the ship moving toward it. It had the head of a cow and, honestly, it didn't really look all that frightening. Without even thinking about it, Luffy sent a glare in the monster's direction. "Buzz off," he growled, his even voice somehow cutting through the thunder and rain. He focused on the power he could constantly feel bubbling just beneath his skin and pushed it outward, Conqueror's haky suffusing through the immediate area around the Mary. He didn't have time to fool around with sea monsters, his navigator needed him. The air around the ship almost immediately became heavier under the weight of Luffy's will, the rain dropping from the sky beginning to look like it was shaking as it fell to the ocean below. The boy sent another glare in the monster's direction, flashing the large animal his eye from underneath his hat. The black pupil seemed to shrink in on itself before flashing back to its original size, the action being accompanied by another more concentrated burst of Conqueror's haky that faded away once it had passed over the creature trying to get in his way. The second wave of willpower rolled over the cow-like sea monster and it immediately began to visibly shake, something like sweat dripping from its large head. The first burst had been more than enough to make it turn tail and run, however, it was literally too frightened to move, and even though it had dissipated, unlike the first burst, the second show of strength had been much more frightening. Without so much as another peep, the creature dipped its head back underneath the water and swam away from the lamb-headed ship with its tail between its legs. Literally. It didn't care if its owners got mad at him, that guy was scary. The straw-hatted pirate captain reined in the haky suffusing throughout the area and almost immediately forgotten as he and Levi continued in the direction of the island he would hopefully find Nami on. It wasn't much longer before the two eventually made it close enough to where Luffy felt comfortable leaving the ship with his friend. He could have tried to anchor somewhere, but odds were the waves would either snap the rope the anchor was connected to, or the Mary would be pulled underwater. Neither of those options was very appealing to him, so he decided to leave the ship with Levi instead. "Alright, buddy," the boy yelled down to the water. "I think I'm gonna swim the rest of the way." The ship began to slow at his words and he dropped Levi's reins to hang around the figurehead of the Mary before launching himself off the wood, into the turbulent waters below. His body crashed into the cold water and he immediately swam up to Levi grabbing onto his side as he pushed them both through the surface of the water. "Take care of the Mary while I'm gone." "Alright, buddy?" Luffy shouted over the rain splashing into the sea all around him. He smiled when the large beast nodded its head and jumped off his back, gracefully diving back into the violently rocking sea. His body found the water once again and he wasted no time in speeding his way in the direction of the island. The storm raged as the teen pumped his arms and legs as quickly as he could, massive waves crashing all around his quickly moving form. However, he paid them no mind. He only had one focus, that focus was Nami, and reaching her as fast as he possibly could. Within minutes of leaving the Mary, the straw-hatted pirate captain felt sand underneath his feet and he immediately stood, sprinting his way to the shore. When he stepped out of the water, his head snapped up and down the coast as he came to a startling realization. Even though he knew Nami was on the island, he still had no idea how to find her. Suddenly, the hair on Luffy's skin rose and his eyes were immediately pulled to the sky, a bright white arc of lightning consuming his vision. He watched it travel for a nanosecond, the white streak striking the island somewhere in front of him, before the accompanying crack of thunder almost burst his eardrums. The boy held his hands over his ears while he gazed in the direction of where he saw the lightning strike and waited for the ringing in his head to die down. When it did, his hands dropped back to his sides and he immediately began to sprint in the direction he was facing. For some reason, It felt like his best chance at finding his navigator. He sighed to himself. If he ended up being right. Black orbs widened when he suddenly remembered that he'd already found the girl playing with lightning once. He immediately cleared his mind at the thought, pushing his legs to move even faster. Hopefully, he wouldn't come across the same scene he did then. Luffy's gaze hardened, his eyes laser-focused on the path in front of him and his legs moving as fast as he could make them. I'm coming, Nami. Just hold on a little longer. Chapter 34. Light in the dark. I said, stop, Nami wailed to the dark clouds above. She would do anything. She just wanted to wake up from this nightmare. She wanted it to be over. The searing pain in her stomach. The tears falling from her eyes. The all-consuming wrath she felt in her heart that was now suffusing throughout her entire body. She wanted it to go away. Her cry continued uninterrupted for but a moment before it seemed like the heavens decided to answer her pleas. The heat consuming the orange-haired girl seemed to freeze inside her body before it all but disappeared into thin air, her tightly closed eyes snapping open in shock. Before she even had the time to register what was going on, a bright white streak of lighting consumed her vision and she watched in morbid fascination while the bolt seemed to move in slow motion, inching ever closer to the men who'd caused her so much pain. The loudest crack of thunder yet echoed through the clearing as lightning struck the ground and consumed every single marine in the retreating group, the Orangeite continuing to watch wide-eyed and confused. When the light faded and the echoing thunder was once again replaced by pounding rain, her shocked brown orbs stayed glued to the now smoking area with a multitude of black bodies resting in it. By sheer force of will, she was able to eventually pull them away and her gaze landed on the dark clouds hanging over her head. Was that her? Nami didn't understand what was going on. Everything since she'd entered the clearing was a blur. Really, a dark red haze of anger and pain. A part of her was convinced that the bolt of lightning had been the world paying her back for all the hardship she'd faced in her life. But, the other part, couldn't help but think, had she been its cause? Had she been the one to kill all the men now lying lifeless on the ground? She remembered the moment right before. The heat, the anger, it was all so hot, until suddenly it wasn't. Still in a slight haze, the Orangeite stood to her feet, slowly beginning to walk in the direction of the group of men she may, or may not, have just killed. How could it have been her? She was just a normal girl. The more she thought about it, the more she felt like it was just a coincidence. But, something in her heart couldn't quite believe that. The big question was, how? She'd never been able to do something like that before. Even as the thought crossed Nami's mind, she realized that it wasn't exactly true. It had been similar when she'd fought Kuro, however, at the same time, it wasn't. The whole situation had been different, so, why? Why did it feel like the two events were connected in some way? The girl's thoughts were brushed to the side when she stopped just outside a large ring of blackened grass filled with the bodies of close to 20 Marines. She couldn't even tell which one was Nezumi. They all looked the same, just lumps of black meat. It was honestly strange. She didn't think lightning would be able to do this to someone. Sure, she knew they'd probably die, but this. Nijiko and Genzo's eyes hadn't left the spot where the lightning struck. They were both so shocked by what had occurred that neither of them could even move. It had looked like Nami had caused it. Like she'd just killed all those men. The two weren't all that upset by the information, considering the situation, but, still, how? Nami traversed the black grass, her mind still in its hazy state. Everything had happened so fast. Her foot hit something solid and she looked down to find one of the sacks filled with her treasure practically glued to the man previously carrying it. She bent down and tried to lift the bag from the ground, almost falling backward when it came up a lot easier than she expected. The Orangeite sent a prayer to the heavens, her heart still on the verge of collapse before she opened it, the black cloth making a cracking sound as it was peeled apart. Her brown eyes found the contents being held in the burnt bag and she had to resist the urge to begin crying once again. Everything inside was ruined. Precious metals now colored black and deformed from the heat of the lightning. Bills burnt to a crisp and barely recognizable. The girl's legs suddenly gave out and her knees hit the mud while she still held the bag of ruined treasure in her hands, staring for a long moment before letting it slide out of the pruny appendages. Tears welled up in the corner of her eyes again, the feeling in her stomach slowly returning. It was always like this, she'd been so close, and yet again, Arlong found some way to ruin it, and it was him. This was his fault. She should have known, she should have seen it. Why did she think this time would be different? Thinking of Arlong sent Nami over the edge and her tears began to fall, her hand tightly gripping her left shoulder. Why? Why her? Why couldn't it have been someone else? Why did she have to be the one to shoulder all this pain? Why couldn't the damn fishman have picked any other island? It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that she had to serve under the same monster who'd taken her mother from her. Her mother, the orangeette, scrambled to turn around in the mud and her eyes immediately found the uprooted tangerine grove beside her home. She tried as hard as she could to keep it in, but another wail left her mouth while she stared at the remains of one of the few things Bellamere left her and her sister. "I hate you!" The girl screamed in anguish, hot tears mixing with the cold rain beating down on her face. The hand gripping her left shoulder tightened, the skin underneath searing painfully. "I hate you!" she screamed to the sky once again, thunder cracking violently over her words. The swordfish tattoo under her palm felt like it was on fire. She wanted it to go away. She began to viciously scratch at the hidden symbol, her nails eventually breaking the skin and drawing blood. However, it wasn't enough. Nami's wild gaze swept through the burnt bodies on the ground looking for anything that could help her get rid of the mark burning her skin, and landed on a small knife that had fallen out of one of the marine's belts. Without even thinking about it, she scrambled forward and snatched the weapon out of the mud, raising it above her head in the blink of an eye. "Arlong!" the orangeette screamed. "You bastard!" She brought the knife down as hard and fast as she could, screaming in agony when she felt the scorched metal rip through the skin on her shoulder. But she couldn't stop. It felt like a dam had been opened, hatred flowing from her like a rushing river. "I hate you!" she screamed again, the knife cutting into her flesh like it was butter. With every strike, her shoulder was further mutilated. However, she made no move to stop. The anger, the pain, it was all too much. Again, the knife was raised above the girl's head and, again, she brought it down with a scream, "I hate yo." Nami's cries suddenly ceased when she felt a hand snatch her wrist out of the air, her wild eyes immediately rising in alarm. When they found the person keeping her hand held above her head, they widened. "Luffy?" she asked disbelievingly. The pirate captain looked down at his bloody navigator, eyes shadowed by the straw hat he always wore and a scowl marring his usually joyful face. "Yo." Wide brown orbs continued to stare. How was he there? More importantly, why? She'd stolen from him and left without a word. Why? Why are you here, Luffy? Why did you follow me? The orangeette asked, still slightly in shock. Was he really actually there? There was a long pause before a reply came. "'Cause I wanted to," Luffy answered, his voice missing its usual carefree tone. Nami scoffed without meaning to, her anger flaring slightly. She ripped her arm from the boy's grasp and the knife fell from her hand, splashing to the ground next to her. "And what about what ist?" her voice coming out more heated than she meant it to. She wasn't angry at him, if anything, she was happy to see him again so soon, but her emotions were getting the better of her. She looked away from the boy and down to the ground. "You're always like this, you have no idea what's going on and yet you still stick your nose in where it doesn't belong," she hissed. No response came at the girl's words, so she looked up again, raising her broken voice to be heard over the rain. "Why are you here, Luffy?" The straw-hatted teen stayed silent for another moment before his head lifted slightly, his eyes unshadowing and a soft smile rising to his lips. His black gaze met Nami's brown one and he seemed to almost stare into her soul as he spoke, "Because, you're my friend." Goosebumps rose up all over the orangeette's skin at the words and a memory began to play behind her wide eyes. She huffed and Luffy heard her swim further away from him. "What's your name, anyways?" he asked, in the direction of the retreating noise. "Why do you need to know my name? We'll probably never see each other again." She found a spot further away from Luffy and glanced at the boy's closed eyes, beginning to make her way down before she caught herself and turned away, a slight blush rising to her cheeks. "Well, I'll never see you again." "What the heck? You don't want to be friends?" Luffy asked as he began lazily paddling his way around the pond, instinctively avoiding the girl. Getting too close might just get him killed. "Why would you even ask that?" she questioned. He continued to float on his back, his muscles starting to feel as if they were melting. "Why not? You already know me pretty well," he giggled. The boy's eyes were beginning to grow heavy, even in their closed state, and his paddling was starting to slow. He felt real good. The water's temperature was just right. The girl's voice mixing with the waterfall was kinda nice to listen to. It was all just so relaxing. Also, he yawned, I like making new friends. And I like to think that's a pretty good reason. Well, I think that's stupid, the unnamed girl said, a frown in her voice. Well, why do you think it's stupid? Luffy asked, curiously. He was too tired to get mad that she had, in a way, called him stupid. Because I can't trust you. Being friends is all about trust. She began, you say you like making friends, but that doesn't make me trust you. Ever since they'd first met, that was all it had ever been about. She'd known it, and yet, she'd always refused to see it, all because he wanted to be a pirate, but now, it was almost impossible to miss. The fact that he was there said it all, because she was right. He had no idea what was going on with her, and yet, still, there he was. All because he saw her as a friend. The thought sent another wave of chills through her body, and she felt tears rise to her eyes once again. They still weren't happy tears, but neither were they tears of anger or pain. It was something more like relief. As Nami looked up at Luffy standing over her, he almost seemed like a pillar of light shining in an abyss of darkness. Thoughts of every unbelievable thing she'd ever seen him do crossed her mind in a flash, and her tearful eyes continued to largen. Why? Why had she never asked him? She knew his strength. She'd seen it with her own eyes. And even though Arlong was the most powerful person she thought she knew, even though he was the man who'd taken everything from her, what had she seen him do that could compare to the miraculous battle she'd witnessed on East Lodestone all that time ago? The Orangeite didn't know if it was the situation she found herself in or her current state of mind, but it suddenly seemed so easy. Luffy, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pouring rain. Please. Her watery brown orbs softened and the corners of her lips threatened to rise even with everything that had happened, because she already knew what his answer would be. Help me, she pleaded. Thunder cracked in the sky and rain pounded to the earth all around the two as they stared at each other in silence. Luffy suddenly broke their eye contact, his gaze shadowing once again. Who? Nami froze for a moment before the name left her lips, nervousness beginning to settle in her stomach. Her head dropped back down and she stared at the muddy ground she sat on. Could he really do it? She knew he could, but it was Arlong, the man that had haunted her nightmares for the majority of her life. Who, Nami? The pirate captain asked again, rain dripping from the brim of his straw hat. The orange-haired girl took a deep breath. Trust, that was what it came down to. She had to trust in him, because he was her friend, and friends trusted in each other. It was just like she'd said back then, Arlong. She finally answered with a small sigh, really long, jagged nose, you can't miss him. Where? Luffy demanded, his jaw clenching as he eyed the blood dripping from Nami's shoulder. The Orangeite slowly looked up before pointing over the treetops at a large building just barely peeking over them. Arlong Park. It's that big building over there. Her gaze dropped back down to the ground, her throat somehow dry even with the pouring rain. Luffy. Something suddenly landed on her head before she could continue and her eyes lifted, to find the brim of a straw hat. Hang on to that for me, Luffy said over his shoulder. Nami's brown orbs widened as she watched the boy walk in the direction of Arlong Park, her hand coming up to softly grasp the golden straw of her friend's treasure. Against her will, more tears began to coat her cheeks while yet another memory, taking place not longer after the previous, flashed through her mind. Hey, perv boy. Nami said, getting Luffy's attention. Said perv boy looked out from under his hat and glanced around the small boat, smiling when he saw Zoro's snoring figure. He turned away from his sleeping friend and sat up. Yeah, what's up Nami? He replied, placing his treasure back on his head. The Orangeite's eyes drifted to his hat before she answered. I've been wanting to ask you about that hat. She said. They'd been sailing for a couple of days now and she was beginning to become curious about the boys she had chosen to travel with. Especially the perv. She couldn't help but be annoyed with herself at that. He was absolutely infuriating, and yet, she still found herself wanting to know more about him. The first thing on Nami's list was the straw hat now resting atop the idiot's head. For some reason, he treated it like it was the most valuable thing in the world. The girl was honestly way more interested in the necklace he always wore, but she'd already been down that road. Thankfully, she'd run into the dead end it led to while he'd been unconscious. She shook her head and got back to the hat. Why's it so important to you? She asked bluntly. He always wore it and it seemed like, to him at least, it was worth its weight in gold, which, ironically, wouldn't probably amount to much, but that was beside the point. A faraway look rose to Luffy's face as he took off the straw hat, smiling at it. Someone I think is really cool gave me this hat. His eyes looked away from the precious gift Shanks had given him and to the girl who'd asked him about it. It's a symbol of our promise to meet again one day. It's one of my treasures, he said before putting the hat back where it belonged. Nami stared at the boy for a moment. The way he made it sound, that hat, to him, was similar to what Bellemere's tangerine trees were to her. The thought made the corners of her lips rise before she brushed the feeling away with an internal scoff. She shouldn't be happy about being able to relate to a pervert. For the first time since she'd landed on her home island, a smile rose to the orange-haired girl's face, a small gasp leaving her mouth as she watched at the edge of the forest. The weight constantly hanging on her shoulders, she suddenly felt so light, it was euphoria. The shackles around her wrists that she'd lived with since the day her mother died, they were gone. Luffy had waltzed in unannounced and practically ripped them from her. The smile on her lips widened, streams of relief filled tears coating her cheeks. "What's your dream, Nami?" the straw-hatted pirate captain asked without turning around. Not for the first time, the orange-haired girl's eyes widened, tears still falling unimpeded. Luffy lowered himself from his stretching position and slowly sat up. His body didn't feel that much better, but he could probably move and that was good enough for him, for now. "Yeah," he exclaimed, "so, are you gonna join my crew, or what?" "Obviously not, I still think pirates are S and that means you'll be S when you become one," Nami stated, looking at him with utter contempt. "Yeah, you're definitely joining," Luffy said, a smile on his lips. "What the hell? No," argued the orange-haired girl, indignant at the boy she was talking with. "Too late," Luffy replied, now laughing. "Not too late. I am not becoming a pirate. I'll never become a pirate," Nami yelled, standing from her chair, huffing, a crazed look in her eye. Luffy paused. He could practically feel her anger and something else too. Maybe sadness. "Fine." He held her gaze. "I'm not giving up though. I'm definitely gonna convince you. You got a dream and something is stopping you from chasing it," he said. Nami's eyes widened. How could he have known that? "I'm gonna convince you to be a pirate with me. Then we can chase our dreams together," said the straw-hatted boy, looking Nami directly in the eyes. The orangeette couldn't help the blush that rose to her cheeks and instead of returning Luffy's gaze, chose to turn away, gathering her things from the table. Nami sighed angrily and made to walk out of the room and end the conversation. "Until then, don't tell me what your dream is. I don't want to know until you agree to be a pirate with me," the boy said to the retreating girl's back. Another memory played directly after the first and Nami couldn't help but stare at the boy in shock. The meaning in his words wasn't lost on her. "We'll be waiting," came Luffy's voice from over the girl's shoulder. "None of us know why you have to go," he said softly, "but I want you to know something." The three boys lifted their hands and her shoulders were grasped by someone. "Once you're done doing whatever it is you need to." The straw-hatted boy turned her to face the group. "You're gonna be my navigator." "A map," the girl whispered breathlessly, her words barely reaching their recipient. Bellemere held the piece of paper in her hands and couldn't help but stare in wonder. She was getting better with each passing day. "A map of our island," she exclaimed proudly. "I knew you could draw ocean charts, but you've learned to do land maps too?" She smiled across the table at her little tangerine, excitedly nodding her head. "What a clever girl." "Yup," Nami stated with a proud smile, her eyes drifting back to the thick book she held in her hands. "I'm studying navigation." The girl's mother looked at her fondly, setting the map lightly on the table. "That's your dream, huh?" "Yup," the orangeette replied, popping the P. "Someday, I'm gonna navigate my way around all the seas." She lightly shut her book and she looked into her mother's happy gaze. "And when I've seen everything with my own eyes, I'm gonna draw a map of the whole world." "A map of the whole world?" Bellemere joyfully laughed. She eyed the drawing of their island for another moment before turning it in the direction of her daughter, smiling lovingly in her direction. "Then this map of the island you drew today is the first step toward your dream." Nami's wide brown orbs stayed glued to the back of Luffy's vest. I want to draw a map of the world." The black-haired boy turned back around to face his navigator and sent her his best smile, a joyful laugh bubbling in his chest. "That's a really cool dream, Nami." He turned away from the girl, setting off toward Arlong Park once again, and looked over his shoulder, smiling one last big smile in her direction. After I beat up this Arbong guy, let's go turn this world upside down together. Nami had to resist the urge to laugh at his mispronunciation. Yeah. She tearfully replied, staring until the boy's form disappeared amongst the dripping trees. After she could no longer see him, all of the tension in the orange-haired girl's body suddenly vanished and she crumpled to the ground, her form laying flat while she stared up at the sky, a large smile still glued to her crying face. She'd never felt so good in her entire life, and, as crazy as it was, part of it was due to the fact that she was now a crew member of the Straw Hat Pirates. Luffy's one and only navigator. She almost couldn't believe it. A year ago she would have never even entertained the idea. But she was different now, and, in her heart, she just knew. Her captain was going to set her free. The thought sent a jolt through the Nami's system and she suddenly realized something. The streams flowing from her eyes growing even heavier, the rain, the oneness, all of it. She could feel it again. Eyelids slowly descended over her red-rimmed brown orbs and she couldn't help the joyful laughs that rose to her chest at what met her when they fully closed. Even though she'd only just shut her eyes, the Orangeite could already feel herself starting to drift off. She didn't think she could move a muscle if she tried, but she didn't really want to. All she wanted to do was keep staring at the beautiful undulating picture of the clearing her home sat in. She got so lost in the current moment that she completely missed the frantic calls of her name, one last thought crossing her mind before she fell from the waking world. She was wrong back then. She should be happy about being able to relate to a pervert, because, meeting that pervert, it might have been the best thing that ever happened to her. Luffy's feet stopped when he met the gate of the place Nami had sent him to, glaring at the brown wood in anger. He took one step forward, planting himself firmly into the ground, before he pulled his arm back, curling the tips of his fingers into the top of his palm. "Sun palm," he roared, his hand flashing forward. The boy's palm connected with the gate and it immediately buckled, a circular shockwave radiating out from the point of impact as wood was scattered in every different direction. Without a second thought, he stepped through what remained of the gate and gazed around the empty courtyard, looking intently for the long-nosed guy who'd hurt his friend. He wanted to punch him, bad. Purru 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 purru. Purru 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 purru. Purru 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 poo, Gad Chaw. "Hello?" a gruff voice on the other side of the line answered. The figure holding the Den Den Mushi nervously peered around the room before bringing the microphone closer to his mouth. "Are you almost here?" The person was a fishman. Specifically, an octopus fishman. He had 8 appendages, 6 arms and 2 legs, and an octopus-like face with a mouth that stuck straight out. Moist pink skin covered his form and his gray hair was styled into 5 pointy spikes, his muscular arms covered by rows of suction cups. The last thing of any real note was the curious sun-shaped tattoo on his forehead. A sigh came from the speaker before the deep voice spoke again. "Stop calling me Hachi. I already told you I'm coming." Hachin's nervousness only seemed to grow at the words, but how much longer? It had been months since he first called him. Sure, he'd been calling a lot more recently, but the thing was, he just couldn't do it anymore. Arlong Park. It felt too much like the place it was modeled after these days, and not in T know when it all changed. No, he did know. A head of orange hair passed through the fishman's head and his stomach twisted. When he thought about how long it had taken him to make the call in the first place, the knots seemed to tighten. "I don't know for sure, Hachi." The voice answered, "I'm swimming as fast as I can." It paused for a moment before another sigh sounded through the speaker. "Listen, Hachi. I'm sorry it took me so long to come, but, I promise, I'll be there soon." The octopus sighed much the same as the voice on the other side of the line. He went to reply, but a loud crash from outside startled him and he immediately hung up the Den Den Mushi, whipping around in alarm. What the hell was that? Arlong went to look for Momoa some time ago, so he should have been getting back around then, but, the sound came from the direction of the gate. Was it Karubi and Chu? They'd left to collect dues from Kokoyashi and would likely be returning soon as well, but still, that noise. Hachin shook his head and cautiously made his way in the direction of the entrance, stepping out onto the tiled stone of the courtyard. His head immediately turned and his eyes found someone he'd never seen before walking through the destroyed remains of the entrance to the park. "You Arbong?" Luffy questioned, coming to a stop as his darkened eyes landed on the figure walking out of the building he'd been directed to. The fishman stared at the boy in shock. Who was this kid? And was he asking if he was Arlong? His shock kept him silent for a moment before he scrambled to reply, "You shouldn't be here. If Arlong came back while he was there, you need to leave," he said, nervously eyeing the port just off to his right. "What the hell's going on here?" a voice from behind the black-haired boy asked in anger, eyeing the remains of the gate. His gaze lifted and found a kid he'd never seen before. He scowled, "Was this your doing, brat?" Luffy turned on his heel and his vision was met with two large fishermen staring at him. The first looked like he was built of pure muscle, his form covered by a sleeveless gi. If the situation were any different, he probably would have laughed at the fishman's black hair. It was pulled up into two small ponytails and he couldn't help but think they closely resembled a pair of bunny ears. The boy pulled his eyes away from the funny-looking hair and, as they slowly moved downward, he noticed he had two pointy fins pushing out of the backside of his arms. What the heck even were those? The pirate captain shook his head and his vision shifted to the other figure standing in the remains of the gate. This one had light blue-colored skin and was only slightly less muscular than the other. His blonde hair was parted down the middle and hung on either side of his head, highlighting the mouth in the middle that sucked straight out from his face. "Either of you named Arbong?" the boy asked, thunder cracking in the sky above while his gaze seemed to pierce through the two fishmen. Karubi scowled at the mispronunciation. "What the hell do you want with Arlong?" Luffy's eyes were grabbed by the figure who'd spoken. "I want to punch him." The conqueror's haky swirling inside of him was practically begging to be released, but he quelled the feeling. He still had his promise to Shanks to think about. "You wanna punch the boss?" Chu scoffed from his position over Karubi's shoulder before sending a glare in the brat's direction. "You'd have to get through us first." This kid was a special kind of idiot. He was practically asking to die. The fishman shook his head and walked up next to his crewmate, leaning on his shoulder, "And I don't like your odds 3-on-1. "So," Luffy said, black orbs shifting to the light blue-skinned fishman, "if I beat you guys up, Arbong will come, right?" His legs tensed, toes curling into the soles of his sandals. "Kid, you really are an idiot," Karubi insulted. "You wouldn't stand a chance against any one of us. Let alone all three." He went to say more, but he was interrupted by the sound of concrete cracking, his now wide eyes watching the black-haired boy launch himself in his direction. "Sun Palm!" Luffy screamed, slamming his leading foot into the ground and wrenching both of his arms backward. They shot forward and his hands connected with the middles of both the fishmen standing there. Twin impact. Shockwaves exploded out of their backs and scattered the rain before it quickly began to pour down again. He watched the two travel through the air for a split second before turning to face the only fishman left standing. The black-haired teen stepped in the octopus man's direction but stopped and turned back around when he heard a voice come from behind. "Not bad, kid," Karubi said, walking through the broken entrance once again, Chu scowling at his side. He lifted his shirt to show the red-colored palm mark on his chest and smirked in the boy's direction. That one actually tickled a little bit. Luffy's eyes widened. That attack had hit hard enough to shatter a person's entire skeleton. The pirate captain's heart began to beat faster and the corners of his mouth lifted. He loved fighting, especially fighting strong guys, and, as angry as he was at the current moment, he couldn't help the smile rising to his lips. Lightning flashed in the sky, illuminating the figure of their soon-to-be opponent, and the two fishmen couldn't help the slight stutter in their heartbeats. For a split second, the blue light in the sky darkened everything but the boy's eyes and his bright white smile. They were sure it was just the elements playing tricks on them, but, in that moment, his eyes seemed to glow blood red. The red gaze, combined with the wide white smile, created the perfect picture of a bloodthirsty demon that had just found its next prey. Karubi involuntarily took a step back when the image flashed across his eyes, Chu following suit. He rapidly blinked the rain out of his vision, still trying to determine if what he'd just seen was real. However, as someone who also enjoyed battle, he could feel his heart rate beginning to rise. He stilled his body with a deep breath and a bloodthirsty grin began to make its way onto his face. "All right, brat. You showed us yours," he said, nodding in Chu's direction and receiving the same gesture in return. "Now let us show you ours." He faced forward once again and his eyes found Hachi still standing at the kid's back. He caught his attention and nodded to him as well. The nod he received from the octopus fishman seemed strange. Reluctant almost, however, Karubi ignored it in favor of meeting his opponent's darkened gaze. "You're not laying a finger on Arlong," he growled, his smile becoming more bloodthirsty with every word he spoke. His muscles tensed and one last yell came from his lips before he launched himself in the direction of his adversary. "You'll be too busy being dead." Chapter 35, Warm-up. "You'll be too busy being dead," Karubi screamed, rapidly sprinting in his opponent's direction. "Hachi!" he yelled, leaping off the ground and high into the air. The hair on Luffy's neck stood straight up and he immediately dropped to the ground, two swords passing above his head. Without thinking, he rolled backward and pushed his hands off the concrete, slamming his feet into the octopus fishman's middle. His vision stayed locked to the large body sailing into the air until it was replaced by a heel descending toward his face and he quickly flattened his form. The pirate captain rolled to the right, standing to his feet as the concrete where he'd been previously been violently shattered. Before the fishman with the weird arms could make another move, he stepped toward him and pulled his arm back in the blink of an eye. When he went to throw it forward, however, the hair on his neck stood up again, his head turning toward the gate to find a flying projectile headed straight for him. Luffy's eyes widened and he twisted his body as quickly as he could, his fist flying in its direction. Pistol. A boom sounded and the rain around the boy scattered, but before he even got the chance to see the projectiles collide, a fist rammed into his face and his body smashed into the ground. "Fishman karate!" Karubi yelled, diving toward his downed opponent. 100-brick fist. Luffy rolled over to face the sky and wasted no time in throwing his arms into a hasty block, gasping when the attack met his guard. The force behind it caused the ground to crack around him and he growled, pushing back with all the strength in his body. A roar left his mouth as he shoved his attacker away and rolled backward, standing to his feet when he felt his soles hit the concrete below. The teen barely even had time to take a breath before his vision was consumed by a multitude of swords. 6 of them to be exact. His eyes carefully watched their sharp edges while he gracefully weaved in between the blades, simultaneously bringing himself into his attacker's guard. Sun palm. Impact. He screamed, his palm finding the middle of the fishman's chest and creating a boom that ripped through the area. Hachi's eyes widened when he felt the air leave his lungs, a circular shockwave of pain rolling through him before his body shot in the opposite direction. Luffy wasted no time in watching the octopus crash into the wall, the sound of cracking concrete filling the air, and shifted his head to the side not a moment too soon. A water bullet grazed the skin on his cheek but the teen barely even felt it, his foot mashing into the ground and sending him in the direction it had come from. Luffy's battle-crazed grin only seemed to grow wider during his approach, his wet sandals slapping against the concrete. Before he'd taken even 3 steps, his form leapt from the earth, fists blurring through the air. "Gatling!" he roared, shockwaves scattering the rain with every punch while a wall of transparent projectiles descended toward the ground below. Debris sailed into the air as the area surrounding Chu was practically ripped apart by the bullets of compressed air. Boom after boom reverberated through the area before the boy's form began to fall back down to the earth, his feet slamming into the ground. He eyed the smoking debris for a moment before the sound of rapid footsteps grabbed his attention. Without turning, Luffy shifted to the side and grabbed the arm careening past him, tightly gripping it before roughly lifting its owner into the air. Karubi's eyes widened when he felt his body begin to descend, a grunt of pain leaving his mouth when his back met the ground. The concrete underneath violently shattered around him and he barely even had time to regain his breath before he was lifted into the air again. The black-haired boy loudly growled as he slammed the fishman into the ground on the other side of him, keeping a firm grip on the wrist in his hand. His head shot up at the sound of shifting debris coming from the gate and his roar grew louder, lifting his opponent once more. He spun on his heel as fast as he could and launched the large form in the direction of the noise using every muscle in his body. Chu groaned at the aches racking his figure, slowly standing amongst the remains of the gate. He tried to move out of the way, but the attack was too fast and covered too much area. His gaze shifted through the destruction surrounding him with a pair of wide eyes. Just who exactly was this kid? The fishman had barely made it back to his feet when his vision was suddenly consumed with a body, his arms shooting out in front of him in an attempt to catch his fellow crew member. However, the momentum the flying form carried was far too much for his hasty attempt. his arms immediately buckling under Karubi's weight. The two collided with a loud smack and were sent careening backward before they forcefully crashed into the debris littering the area. Luffy huffed in exertion, his large smile still firmly in place. He was having fun. He hoped this Arbong guy showed up soon, though, that was his name, right? He shook the thought away. Regardless of what his name was, he wanted to beat him up so bad. The bastard had made his navigator cry, and that was unforgivable. His head shifted away from the gate and to the wall he'd sent the octopus into, his black orbs widening slightly when he saw he was no longer there. Octopus pot stance. Hachi shouted, thrusting all of his swords toward the middle of his opponent's chest. He expected the boy to try and block, so when the tips of his blades instead met the center of a palm, his eyes widened. Sun palm. Shatter. Luffy screamed. He grunted when the sword's tips pierced his skin, but the pain only lasted a moment, a shockwave radiating through the weapons and sending spiraling cracks through them. He sent a silent thank you to Zoro for his advice back when they'd been bounty hunting. It had taken a while, but, with some help from his first mate and his knowledge of swords, he'd eventually figured it out. His hand continued pushing forward and suddenly the air was filled with the sound of shearing metal. Hachi didn't even have time to watch his blades shatter, just barely managing to stay on his feet as he skidded backward. He gasped at the ache in his hands, dropping what was left of the swords before his vision was suddenly consumed by a pair of black eyes. Lightning flashed in the sky and, for a moment, the black orbs seemed to glow blood red, freezing the fishman in place. He was sure it wasn't real, but, in that split second, he thought he'd seen the face of a smiling demon. The pirate captain slammed his foot into the ground and stepped into his paralyzed opponent's guard, his curled knuckles flying forward and finding the fishman's middle pistol. Hachi's frame buckled under the blow and he immediately felt a few of his ribs crack, a boom ripping through the area as he shot off toward the port like a speeding bullet. He connected with the wall facing the sea and flew straight through it, the sound of shattering concrete being followed by the splash of his body sailing into the ocean. Luffy spun on his heel and pushed off his toes, sprinting in the direction of the gate. He shifted his head to the side, narrowly dodging a water bullet passing by his face, and jumped in the middle of his stride. Just before Chu went to unleash his own version of the kid's Gatling attack, his consciousness suddenly vanished from the waking world, blood flying from his mouth as a sandal smashed into the side of his face and sent him violently crashing back into the ground. Luffy quickly stepped off his downed foe and turned not a moment too soon, a fist flashing in his direction. His arm snapped up and knocked the attack off course before he dashed behind Karubi, his feet leaving the earth once again. His leg shot outward just as the fishman turned to face him and met a hasty guard. Karubi's arms strained against the leg, pushing into them to force the appendages away, sending his opponent flipping backward. The black-haired teen deftly landed and turned on a dime, his eyes widening when they were met with empty space. His vision shot upward when he heard a shout coming from above and he couldn't help but send the descending figure a large battle-fueled smile. Fishman karate. Karubi screamed, coming out of his flip and bringing his heel down with enough momentum to split a boulder, axe kick. Luffy shifted out of the way and the attack shattered the concrete directly in front of him. Before the fishman had even made to stand back up, the boy was behind him. Impact, he screamed, his palm finding the center of his opponent's back. Karubi hissed when he felt a shockwave roll through his body, his eyes widening when he was lifted off his feet and sent careening in the direction of the port. His body ragdolled in the air as he tried to right himself and he crashed into the ground, rolling to a stop just before he would have fallen into the water. Luffy was already in pursuit once again, sprinting toward the water and trying to reach the fishman before he could recover. Just as he made to leap off the ground once more, a series of loud splashes grabbed his attention and he stopped himself, sliding to a stop on the slick concrete. It sounded like someone swimming, and fast. Hachi ink jet, Hachi yelled, breaking the surface of the water and shooting a deluge of black ink from his large mouth. It only took a moment for the pirate captain to realize that he needed to move, but it was already too late. In an attempt to duck under the ink, he let his body drop to the ground but was far too slow, his face receiving the full force of the attack. His vision suddenly went dark when the black liquid connected and his head snapped backward. Luffy's back painfully hit the ground and he rolled away from the attack, desperately rubbing a hand over his face in an attempt at restoring his vision. He scowled when he realized it was futile. What even was this stuff? Was it spit? The thought made him cringe slightly. Gross, he said to himself, quickly rising back to his feet. Fishman karate. 100 brick fist. Karubi roared, his fist flying toward his now blind opponent. Luffy suddenly felt a fist slamming into his gut and gasped when the air left his lungs, his feet leaving the ground as he flew backward. His back hit the concrete and he wasted no time in standing back up, pain radiating from his stomach. An irritated growl left the boy's lips and he quickly began moving again, furiously rubbing at his eyes. He had no more success than the last time he'd tried. Damn it, he yelled, hands dropping back down and clenching into fists. He couldn't see anything and the rain was dulling both his senses of sound and smell. How was he supposed to keep fighting? The hair on Luffy's neck stood straight up and he dove forward, rolling when he hit the concrete. That feeling, it had been something that started on East Lodestone, but he'd never paid that much attention to it. He quickly stood back to his feet and continued darting around the area like a chicken with its head cut off. Maybe it was something he should focus on more. With his vision gone, it didn't sound like a bad idea. Before the teen could finish the thought, a gasp left his mouth, and the ground underneath his feet vanished. He was suddenly flying through the air, not even thinking to hold his breath, before he was consumed by the waters of the ocean. Still currently blind, Luffy immediately burst through the surface of the water with a gasp, taking in as much air as he could. The cold liquid had been quite the shock to his system and his lungs were in overdrive as he tried to slow his heart rate down. The hair on his neck stood up again and, without any other avenue of escape, he dove back underneath the water, something heavy splashing into the space he'd previously occupied. Karubi's fins sliced through liquid instead of the head he'd been aiming for and he growled, letting his body be pulled into the ocean. His vision immediately found his prey swimming in the opposite direction and he grinned. A second form splashing into the water and stopping beside him. You're dead meat now, kid. Nami's eyes drifted open and her blurry vision was met with a wooden ceiling. The waking fog surrounding her mind slowly began to lift as she shifted her body underneath the warm sheets covering her. Nami, exclaimed Nijiko, tearfully standing from her chair next to the bed and practically tackling her sister. The orange's breath left her lungs and she gasped for air while the blue-haired girl held onto her like a lifeline. Nijiko, she hissed, can't breathe. The arms surrounding her loosened immediately and she sucked in a breath as fast as she could, waiting for her breathing to even out before looking down at the girl still tightly attached to her. It felt like it was the first time Nami had really seen her in what felt like years. The corners of her eyes began to prickle and her arms wrapped around the girl still clinging to her side. I missed you, Nijiko. She whispered into the top of her blue hair. The words only seemed to make the girl's body shudder more while the two stayed attached to one another. Glad to see you're okay, Nami, Genzo said, stepping into the room with a small smile resting on his lips. He'd never admit it, but the sight he'd walked in on made his eyes water slightly. The orange-haired girl looked up from her sister's head and her gaze met the man slowly walking into the room, returning the smile he was sending her. Hey, Genzo. Her eyes glanced up to his hat and she couldn't help the laugh that left her lips. Still wearing that pinwheel, I see. Genzo didn't answer, softly sitting on the other side of the bed before reaching over to grab the two girls in a loose hug. As happy as he was at the sweet reunion, the guilt eating at his stomach soured the moment. I'm sorry, Nami, he said before he could stop himself. Nijiko finally loosened her grasp on her sister and sat back up, the girl's arms falling back to the bed while her face took on a similar look to the man across from her. Nami looked between the two for a moment in confusion. When neither went to explain, she spoke up, What do you mean, Genzo? The scarred man looked down at his hands in shame. That damn Nezumi. Those Marines, I'm the one that told them where the stash was, he admitted, his jaw clenching in anger. Stop it, Genzo, Nijiko exclaimed, turning to explain further. Nezumi threatened to have me arrested, she said. She saw her sister's expression darken at the mention of the Marine captain but continued nonetheless. Genzo knew he didn't know where your stash was, so he called his bluff. Her hand came up to softly hold her bruised cheek, her voice quieting. Nezumi didn't like that, he said he was going to key. The blue-haired girl's words were suddenly cut off when Nami grabbed the two in a hug once again. The Orangeit released them from her grasp and smiled at the pair, looking at them for a moment before pulling them back into her chest. "It doesn't matter now," she whispered, her heart rate rising at the thought. "I'm just happy to see the both of you." She released them once again and immediately pushed the covers off of her, making to stand. She wanted to go to Arlong Park. She had to. She had to be there to see her captain set her free. "I'm going to Arlong Park," she declared, slipping past her sister to swing her feet off the bed. Nijiko and Genzo both looked at each other in alarm before scrambling to follow the girl to the door. "But, Nami, your treasure," the blue-haired girl said cautiously. It's ruined." She and Genzo had gone to check and see if any of it was still worth anything, and they'd only been able to recover a few small pieces of gold and jewelry that hadn't been too severely deformed. It wasn't even close to enough to buy the village. Like I said in their direction and stepped into the living room, making her way toward the entrance to her home. "It doesn't matter now." Her grin widened at the straw hat sitting on the table and she softly placed it back on her head before moving to grasp the handle of the door. She pulled it open, the sound of water pounding to the ground now coming through the opening, and stepped out into the pouring rain. The Orangeit looked over her shoulder at the two people still following her with a smile. "My captain is going to set me free." She turned away and her eyes found the top of Arlong Park peeking over the trees. "He's going to set us all free." "But, Nami," Nijiko yelled over the pouring rain, "you don't have the money anymore." The words didn't seem to reach their recipient and she shot the man standing beside her a nervous glance. "What does she mean, Genzo? Isn't Arlong her captain?" The scarred man eyed Nami's back as she continued to make her way in the direction of Arlong Park before he turned to Nijiko. "I don't know," he replied uncertainly. He was brought back to earlier in the day, after the lightning strike. That was something they still needed to talk about. He shook the stray thought away and nodded after the girl's retreating form, his eyes glued to the straw hat she'd been given. As they followed the Orangeit into the forest, Genzo couldn't help but wonder, who exactly was that boy from earlier? The black ink obscuring Luffy's sight had long since been dissolved by the water, but his vision was still blurry, the saltiness of the sea stinging his eyes as he pushed himself to swim as fast as he could. "Fishman karate. Forearm slash," Karubi yelled, bursting through the water on a direct line for his target. As good of a swimmer as he was, the teen still couldn't manage to completely dodge the fishman's sharp elbows, two clouds of red erupting from his right shoulder. He hissed in pain, losing some of the air in his lungs but made no move to retreat, pulling his arm back and curling his hand into a fist. "Water shot," he roared, the words being muffled by the clear liquid surrounding him. Even though his mobility was reduced, the boy's fist flashed forward in the direction of his opponent and something akin to a speeding ocean current left his knuckles. Karubi abruptly halted his approach and shot off to the side, grunting when he felt the blunt force of the attack ram into his hip. He was sent careening through the water before he quickly righted himself, glaring at the kid now moving back toward the surface, likely to take another breath. Somehow, the brat was keeping the fight relatively even with the number and terrain advantages on their side. The thought made him growl, looking down to the bruises covering his body before his glare shot back up. The pirate captain's head broke the surface of the water and he sucked in a deep breath of air just before he was pulled back under, a slimy tentacle wrapping around his ankle. Hachi ripped his arm downward before releasing the hold he had on the ankle in his hand, his opponent's body sailing through the water on a direct course for Karubi. As he watched the boy travel through the water, indecisiveness ate at him. This wasn't a fight he wanted to be a part of. He peeled his eyes away from the descending form and gazed to somewhere that couldn't be seen. The fishman hoped he would arrive soon. Luffy scrambled to regain control of his body, but soon found his momentum halted by a hand grabbing him by the wrist. Air left his lungs when a fist buried itself into his stomach and he gasped, large bubbles rising from his lips. He desperately tried to wiggle out of Karubi's grip, but it felt impossible with encroaching water. He just couldn't move anywhere near as well as he could on land. Kuroi's fist flashed out over and over again, knocking more and more air from Luffy's lungs while he continued to struggle in place. His body ached from the impacts and, while he could probably hold his breath longer than most, he didn't know how much longer he could hold out under the onslaught he was receiving. Karubi's smile widened maniacally as he halted in his attack. "You're pretty strong, kid," he admitted, his vision dropping down to find the dark depths below. Bringing his head back up, his smile widened at the struggling boy caught in his grasp, but you were dead the moment you fell into the water. The teen's fingers slipped under the hand holding his wrist and he desperately pulled at it, but, by then, it was already too late. Fishman karate. The fishman roared, suddenly bursting through the water and dragging his captive into the darkness of the deep sea, pulverizing pressure plunge. Luffy's body swirled violently as he was pulled through the water against his will. All of his focus went into holding his breath, his lungs already screaming at him to take in more oxygen. The pirate captain's blurry sight continued to darken as he was pulled deeper and deeper into the sea, the pressure around his body beginning to increase the further they descended. His lungs begged him for air while they compressed under the weight of the clear liquid encompassing him, ragdolling as water rushed around his figure. Suddenly, the teen's momentum was halted and his shoulder felt like it almost came out of its socket. He resisted the urge to grunt and his head wildly shifted around, black consuming him on all sides while the pressure tried to crush him. The hand gripping his wrist disappeared, but before he could even think about starting the long swim back up to the surface, a loud voice cut through the darkness. Fishman karate. Karubi roared, his smile widening to even larger proportions as he watched his helpless opponent scramble to escape to the surface. He pulled his fist back and twisted his core, loading as much power as he could into his arm. No human could survive this, and even if he somehow did, the brat would run out of air soon, anyway. His knuckles shot forward, the water seeming to part when a shockwave rolled through the clear liquid surrounding him, thousand brick fist. Even though he was underwater, the hair on Luffy's neck seemed to stand up again and he desperately shifted his eyes through the darkness. Suddenly, all the air he had left in his lungs vanished when a fist rammed into the center of his chest, his form flashing through the water and crashing violently into the ocean floor. The spongy surface softened the impact slightly, but vicious pain still spread through his body as the ground ruptured and a massive cloud of displaced dirt erupted around him. Karubi eyed the dark cloud for a moment before smirking in satisfaction. He'd had more fun than expected while fighting the little brat. He eyed the bruises littering his body. Wincing at the severe aches he could feel now that his battle lust had faded. Arlong always said that fishmen were the superior species and this fight cemented it, but he eyed the area for another moment. That kid was pretty damn strong. The fishman shook his head, turning away from the dark cloud still hanging in the water, and began his swim back up to the surface. Air. He needed air. If he didn't get it, he was definitely gonna die. The thought made the black-haired boy panic slightly. Not in fear of death, however, no, the only thing that frightened him was the thought of not being able to match the man who'd made his navigator cry. He grit his teeth and scrambled to lift his aching body, his heartbeat growing louder in his ears with every second that passed. A painful stab shot through his chest and he almost buckled, letting the pressure of the ocean settle on his shoulders as he bent his knees. He needed to get to the surface, now. Luffy's head lifted up before he curled his body as tightly as he could, his legs coiling beneath him while he ignored the muffled grinding of cracked bones emanating from his chest. His toes dug into the soles of his sandals and he suddenly launched himself from the ocean floor with he had. A muffled boom reverberating through the water. Karubi whipped around at the sound coming from below and his eyes widened, shock keeping him frozen in place. Another massive brown cloud erupted around the teen and he shot through the water like a speeding bullet. In but a moment, the darkness consuming his vision began to be rapidly replaced by light as he rushed by his opponent's still figure, but it was quickly growing dark once again. His chest felt like it was going to explode and as fast as he was moving, it wasn't enough. He wasn't going to make it before he passed out. Karubi's shocked gaze stayed locked onto the teen's form as it continued to sail toward the surface. What the hell was this kid? His paralyzation lasted for another moment before he came to his senses, a growl leaving his lips before he shot through the water in pursuit. Luffy's momentum began to decrease and his vision was getting darker by the second, his mind growing hazy from lack of oxygen. It was close, the surface was close. He just knew it, he just had to get there. He tried to start swimming, but the action only sent more pangs through his chest. His body curled in on itself as it tried to somehow expel the pain shooting through it and the haze in his mind continued to grow, his position bringing him back to moments earlier. He didn't know if it was the lack of oxygen or what, but A strange thought floated through his head: if he could push off the ground like that, why couldn't he do the same with the water? Karubi pumped his arms and legs as quickly as he could, his opponent's slowing form entering his vision once again. He grit his teeth and pushed himself to move even faster. He was making sure the damn brat was dead this time. Luffy kept himself curled and tensed every muscle in his lower body. One more would get him there. He'd need to push even harder this time. The water wasn't solid like the seafloor, so it was definitely going to be a lot more difficult. With every ounce of energy left in his body, the black-haired boy desperately uncurled his body and his legs shot out below him, his feet smashing against the water so hard that the liquid compressed for a split second. A massive shockwave rolled through the ocean as Luffy once again blasted his way toward the surface and, just before he would have lost consciousness, his body burst through the water. The pirate captain sailed into the air, roughly landing back on solid ground, and tumbled a small distance before stopping, eyes hazily gazing at the sky. His vision seemed to go in and out with the rhythm of his heartbeat while he sucked in air as fast as he could. Only a moment passing before he heard the thumps of feet meeting concrete coming from off to the right. His head lolled to the side and his eyes were met with two figures rapidly sprinting in his direction. Oh, yeah, he was still fighting. With his heart still trying to beat out of his chest, Luffy rolled to the right, a heel cracking into the concrete where he'd previously laid. It took more effort than he would have liked, but he stood to his feet and turned just in time to slip under a tentacle headed for his face. Another one, aimed at his middle, shot out and he grabbed it without thinking, roughly pulling its owner toward him while his curled knuckles shot out at the same time. Pistol. Hachi's mind had barely registered what was going on when he suddenly felt a fist ram into his nose. Blood flying from his mouth. Most of the bones in his face shattered, the skin rippling with the impact, and his body left the ground. The last thing the octopus fishman saw before his mind went dark was the backrest of the stone chair sitting in front of Arlong Park's main building as he smashed straight through it, cracking into the wall not 2 feet from his earlier impact print. Luffy's breaths continued to come fast and short, his hands dropping down to his knees for a moment before a roar came from his left, his head shifting in its direction. He'd had enough with these guys. A fist shot out in his direction and he breathed deeply, launching off the ground to flip over the fishman's head. He righted himself in the air before he began to drop downward and the bottoms of his legs found the tops of his opponent's shoulder. The teen kept himself glued to his opponent, his thighs tightly squeezing around Karubi's neck and locking at his front while the fishman desperately clawed at him. Without another thought, his hands flashed straight out to his sides, his fingertips curling inward. Karubi wildly whipped around, trying anything to remove the boy sitting on his shoulders, but no matter what he did, the brat stayed in place. In his scrambling, he managed to get his hands under the legs wrapped around his neck. However, just when he went to wrench them off, his opponent's voice made him look up. "Sun Palm!" screamed Luffy. He tightened his grip on the fishman's neck before his hands smashed inward. Bell. His palms impacted on either side of the head held tightly between his thighs and a crack pieced the stormy air. Blood shooting from his opponent's nose and mouth as the surrounding rain violently scattered. The two seemed to stand still for a moment, the echoing crack once again being replaced by pounding rain, before Karubi's body suddenly went limp, his open eyes wide and showing no signs of lucidity. The pirate captain rode his opponent to the ground, stepping off of him when the fishman's knees met the concrete, and his breathing finally began to even out. Luffy couldn't help but sigh in relief. Almost drowning sucked bad. His eyes shifted around the area and took in all the destruction. They had really done a number on the place. The area where the gate previously rested was completely destroyed, nothing but a large pile of debris with an unconscious body lying on it, and the courtyard had a multitude of craters marring its surface, broken stone meeting his eyes wherever he looked. He was glad that he wasn't the one who had to clean it all up. Luffy turned toward the building behind him and noticed that it was the only thing that had been left practically untouched. Besides the two huge craters, his gaze was pulled to the octopus fishman buried into the wall and he couldn't help but think that it didn't look like a very comfortable place to sleep. He shrugged his shoulders and looked down at the form lying at his feet for a moment before turning away. Now, there would be no interruptions during his fight with, what was his name again? Arsong? Argon? Arbon? The black-haired teen shook his head, none of the names sounding quite right. and moved to take a seat on the broken throne sitting at the front of the large building. He didn't have anything other to do than wait, so that's precisely what he did, taking some time to examine the state of his body. His breathing was pretty much back to normal, and Luffy couldn't help the slight shudder that ran through him at remembering the feeling of almost drowning. He quickly shook the thought away and went over the rest of his body. Besides the 2 bleeding cuts on his shoulder and the cracked bones in his chest, everything else was rather tame. He had some bruises where he'd taken some hits and his body was pretty atchy, especially the large bruise on his chest, but other than that, he didn't feel too bad. With his inspection done, the pirate captain once again began to wait, leaning forward to bring his hand into his vision. He clenched the appendage in anticipation. He felt warmed up enough to go all out right from the start. Luffy's eyes lifted and his black gaze shifted toward the place he'd left his navigator, a large smile rising to his lips. He hoped his opponent would show up soon, because he was about to beat the bastard straight into the ground.